CLAWED, Were Soldier Warriors, Book 1. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Chapter 1. Jessica Delaney took a deep breath and did her best not to lose her cool with the grinning, portly, older man in front of her, dressed in safari khakis. He topped her by a full foot and looked utterly unimpressed by her urgency, her World Health Organization credentials and authorizations, or anything else she brought to bear. "Look, love," he said, "I can't help it, can I, that some earl or duke or something from bloody Hungary decided that he wanted to go big game hunting and offered me treble what you did." "We had an agreement," Jessica said heatedly. "Do you not understand that this is a matter of life and death? People are dying. An entire native tribe just wiped off the face of the earth. I cannot express the urgency with which I must get these supplies into the hot zone. Yes, yes. You've told me that a time or two, as I recall." Jessica looked at him impatiently, her blue eyes blazing fire. "Might I remind you that my organization chose you because you claim to be a professional? Now, I need you to honor our signed agreement and get me where I need to go." For a moment, it looked as though the pilot was going to give in. But then he just grinned a little wider, seemingly amused by Jessica's tenacity. "Your agency chose me because there are precious few pilots foolhardy enough to attempt to fly the route between Kilimanjaro and Lake Victoria," he said. "Cool your heels. Head into Dar es Salaam. It'll take a little longer, and you'll pay a little more, but it'll get you to whatever little backwater you've been babbling about." She gritted her teeth, glaring at him. "Too much time, too much money," she said. "I have lives to save. The WHO needs this information. The Tanzanian government needs this information. You would be doing an enormous service." The pilot laughed outright at that. "Love, when the WHO or the Tanzanian government does a damn thing for me, that'll be the day when I bend over and take it up the arse for one of them. Until then, I suggest you and your little medical satchel hightail it down to Dar es Salaam and—" He trailed off, which was a good thing because Jessica was distressingly close to pummeling him with her little medical satchel. She followed his gaze off to the right. The small, dusty private airfield off the coast of Tanzania was desolate to say the least, but it was not deserted. There was another white man, tall and broad-shouldered, standing in the cool shadows of the hangar. He was under the wings of a small plane that most certainly looked as though it had seen better days. As Jessica watched, she saw the tall man hand a wad of cash off to a black man who walked away shaking his head. "What the hell am I seeing?" she wondered, and then the pilot next to her grinned. "All right, you want a ride, love? You for sure want to get out to the middle of nowhere in Tanzania?" Jessica scowled at him. "Stop calling me love," she said automatically. "And yes, that's the gist of what I've been saying. So glad we're finally on the same page." She had a bad habit of being completely unable to curb her sarcasm at times. "All right then, let's see what I can scare up. Just remember, I'm doing this out of the goodness of my heart, right?" She sighed and nodded, watching with some apprehension as he sauntered over to talk to the man who had apparently just bought himself a plane. There was something about the tall, broad-shouldered man in the shadows that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. As he turned, she could almost see what appeared to be a strikingly handsome face, his tan skin dark against the light tactical gear he was wearing. Jessica was reminded of her training. She'd been warned about the European soldiers of fortune that haunted Eastern Africa looking for bodyguard work or less legal, more lucrative opportunities. These men were to be considered highly dangerous, especially to a short, slight woman wandering the earth doing good work for global health organizations. But there was something else about this man that made it impossible for her to tear her eyes away. She saw her portly pilot pull the taller man into conversation, and at first it didn't seem as if the conversation was going in a favorable direction. The man was resistant to whatever her pilot was proposing, putting up his hands in an attempt to stop the man, but then something the older pilot said made the taller man look up at her. Jessica shivered. Even from where she stood, she could see that the man's eyes were a bold, pale green, glittering like glass. If she were back in New York, she would have guessed expensive tinted contact lenses. But who the hell would wear something like that out here? She gripped her knapsack and medical bag tighter. So many things had gone wrong since she took off from New York. Please, please, couldn't something finally go right? Whatever you want, the answer is no, Bernie, Marcus said shortly. I don't have time for your bullshit scams right now. Hey now, is that any way to speak to an old comrade in arms? Grinned Bernie. Don't you forget, I was there when all that malarkey went down in Johannesburg. You ran away from Johannesburg like someone set your ass on fire, Marcus retorted. Don't make me laugh. It was probably better that Bernie had been a coward, though, Marcus had to admit. There had been a few humans mixed up in that clusterfuck, and when the dust had settled and everything was sorted out, the Shifter Council had stepped in and dealt out a generous round of memory cleansing and recriminations for all. Bernie had never gotten close enough to the truth, and for that he was lucky. Yeah, well, have I got an offer for you today, mate? Marcus shook his head with a short laugh. Don't need you to sell me a girlfriend either, he said, and Bernie made an offended sound. Hey, this one's all right. She's a doctor or something, a do-gooder, on her way to save lives out in the bush. You'd be getting yourself some good karma along with picking up a paycheck. Chance like that doesn't come along every day. Marcus started to turn the man down again, but then, almost as if his head was on a marionette string that had been pulled up, he glanced over at the girl that Bernie was referring to. Marcus felt as if he'd taken a blow to the chest, knocking the breath right out of him. He had to consciously make his lungs force air into themselves. After he realized he was staring, he looked away. Bernie was still going on and on about how she was going to save indigenous tribes from some strange affliction or deadly disease or something. But Marcus wasn't really listening. Some of his kind did their best to hide their primitive instincts, to live amongst humans with their senses dulled down as much as they could be. Marcus, on the other hand, had sharply honed his instinctual senses, which were much needed in his profession. Right now, his instincts were firing off like mad. The girl wasn't much to look at. She was short and slender, not the type to catch the attention of a man who liked his women tall and lush. But once he saw her, he couldn't take his eyes off her. Even as he tried to focus on what Bernie was saying, he found his glance drifting back to her. She looked vulnerable, but proud, standing straight as an arrow in the middle of the field, her black hair cut short as if hacked with a machete. She was dressed for the country at least, wearing a long green linen skirt and a pale green shirt that covered her arms. She had the look of a lost traveler, but then he glimpsed her eyes. They were a blue so bright that for a moment Marcus wondered if he had run into a woman of his own kind somehow, all unawares. Then, reason and his senses reasserted themselves. This woman was human, but in those eyes, he had glimpsed something determined almost to the point of madness. She was going to get what she wanted, and damn whoever stood in her way. I wouldn't try it, mate, Bernie advised. Someone invited her for a drink just a bit ago, and she nearly chewed his head off and spit it down his neck hole. Not really the huggy type, you know? I think I do know. It was in that moment Marcus came to a decision. There were a few legitimate reasons that could back up his decision-making, but in the back of his mind, he knew that those reasons were just retroactive excuse-making. The truth was, something inside him wanted to be close to the small, dark-haired woman. Something that refused to be denied. All right, we'll see how this goes. Chapter 2. Jessica felt a wave of apprehension snake up her spine when the older pilot headed back to his own plane and the tall stranger made long, purposeful strides her way. As annoyingly slimy as the older pilot was, she almost wanted to turn and catch him. At least he was a known quantity. She stood up straight and met the stranger squarely in the eyes. It meant that she had to tilt her head back to do it. God, he was tall and broad. He had to be at least 4 or 5 inches over 6 feet, and the military gear, banned in this country if she wasn't mistaken, made him appear even larger. He had thick, sandy hair brushed back from a face that was surprisingly stern and angular, but his lips were full and curved in an appraising smile as he approached her. Something about just looking at this man sent sensuous tingles through her. He was so masculine, so raw male, so animalistic. She quickly repressed the thoughts, because being distracted in an environment such as this one sure as hell wasn't safe. So what's your story? He asked, gazing down at her from his superior height. A woman alone on an airstrip in Tanzania, asking to be flown into the butthole of the African continent. What gives? My name is Jessica, and I'd like to know to whom I'm talking before I delve into my life story, she said stubbornly. Jessica had learned not to give a single inch while she was traveling, especially when it came to men, but her curtness didn't seem to deter this one at all. He just grunted and raked his eyes up and down her build, as though trying to evaluate her out. Marcus Vanderberg, he said after a few moments. Does that satisfy you? This time she could detect a slight hint of an accent in his voice. There was something bright and sharp to it that made her think of the patois spoken in South Africa. But that wasn't all, was it? There was something else she couldn't put her finger on. I'll be honest, not really, she said. Can't you do any better? He paused for a moment, and she could see him sorting through any number of things. Jessica knew that whatever came out of his mouth next was going to be a lie, and at this point, that bothered her less than it probably should have. Let's say that my specialty is anthropology, he said with a shrug. You're an anthropologist. It wasn't a very good lie, she thought. Not for a man alone, dressed in military gear, flying into a volatile region in the butthole, as he put it, of the continent. He hesitated. I'm not in the field, officially, but I've worked with plenty who are. I see, she said slowly. Just tell me one thing. He looked more amused than she would have preferred, but he nodded. It struck her that it had been a while since she had seen a man this attractive, and she had spent time in New York during Fashion Week. God, how long had it been since she had a boyfriend? All right. Please promise me that neither the Tanzanian police nor Interpol are after you. That surprised a laugh out of him at least, but he shook his head. No, they're not after me at all. I promise. She noticed that there was a slight emphasis on the word there, but at this point, She was a beggar who couldn't be choosy. Okay then. Did what's-his-name tell you where I was going? He did, and said that you would provide the exact coordinates. The man, Marcus, nodded. Now, I have a few stipulations. Go on, she said warily. This shouldn't be necessary. Ideally, I load you up like a piece of baggage. You step out to stretch your legs at a couple refueling stops. I put you down exactly at said coordinates. We kiss goodbye, and that's that. However, Tanzania's a wild, untamed place, especially as we venture from Dar es Salaam and Mwanza. If things go wrong, which I stress is somewhat unlikely, I'm going to need you to do exactly as I say, no matter how strange or upsetting it may sound. You got that? Jessica chewed her lower lip. And if I say no? Then we kiss goodbye right here, and you find your own lift. I don't have much of a choice then, do I? Okay, you win. If things go wrong, I'll listen to whatever you say, without question. Marcus smiled at her, and again she felt tingles. Something about this man's mere glance felt as if he had slid warm fingers seductively down her bare spine. Good girl, he said, and before she could protest being called a girl, he was leading her to his plane. There was something about her, and for the life of him, Marcus couldn't figure out what the hell it was. It would be one thing if he was just attracted to her, but it wasn't just that. There was something about her that was drawing him like iron fillings to a magnet, and the fact that he wasn't able to explain it pissed him off. He left her well enough alone when they were in the air, but when they stopped for their first refueling, and she looked like she was going to stay on the plane, he shook his head. Told you. Part of the package deal is that you walk around the airfield. Come on. She went easily enough, and as he got the plane refueled and checked in with his contacts, she stayed close. He supposed it made sense, woman on her own in Tanzania, but more than once, he caught her bright eyes on him, as if she too was trying to figure him out. Marcus ignored her. She was human after all, and she wasn't even armed. He had real problems to contend with on this flight, and one little researcher wasn't one of them, no matter how attractive she was. Back on the plane, once they had gained some altitude, the girl, Jessica, came to sit next to him in the cockpit. She watched him for so long that he finally looked over at her. Been a while since you've been with a man? He asked. That why you're looking at me like that? She refused to take offense, which was unfortunate. If she had, she would have gone back to the bay, and he wouldn't have that uneasy attraction in the pit of his stomach whenever she got too close. No, I was just thinking. You're hiding from someone, aren't you? What makes you say that? You dragged me off the plane when we refueled. At first, I thought you were just making sure I didn't steal anything. But then I realized that there was nothing to steal. There really isn't. He agreed, but she continued. So you wanted to make sure that everyone who saw you saw us. A man and a woman together, not a man traveling alone. Am I right? He glanced at her, amused. She sat with her arms across her chest, trying to act nonchalant, but unwilling to move forward without the truth. I'm gonna go with yes. Why do you want to know? She shrugged. I wanted to make sure we got our story straight, Jessica replied. Maybe I shouldn't go around telling the world that I'm traveling with Marcus Vanderberg, who is adjacent to the anthropology field without being a part of it. He laughed at that. Not even the least little bit worried, are you? She smiled, and for a moment, he could see a flash of pure steeliness in her eyes that left him slightly breathless. God, she should have been born one of his kind. As long as you get me where I need to go, that's all that matters to me right now. Bernie said something about medicine. Are you with Doctors Without Borders? Something like that? No, I'm with the World Health Organization. We're working with the Tanzanian government to figure out a deadly illness that seems to have several hotspots throughout western Tanzania. This one looks pretty bad. So I'm on the ground to take samples, bring a few supplies, run what tests I can in situ. Ah, then you're saving lives? Her gaze darkened slightly. I hope so, she admitted. The prognosis for this one, it's not good. I'm not the only one taking samples, but until we get more information, there's not a lot to be done. These things have a way of working themselves out. At least they do when people as determined as you are involved. She smiled, but lapsed into a morose silence. Impulsively, Marcus reached over to squeeze her hand gently, but then they both cried out in surprise. The moment he touched her, the moment they touched each other, a spark of electricity leapt from her hand to his. It was as bright and unmistakable as a lightning bolt shot through a clear evening sky, and Marcus could feel the echo of that powerful sensation resonate through his whole frame, coming to rest low in his groin. He realized with the strength of pure instinct that he wanted this woman, that something in her was calling to him. It was reaching right past the human part of his brain, back to the part where the beast resided, and that could be a very dangerous thing for both of them. Marcus swore softly in Dutch, and Jessica jerked her hand back as if she had touched a stove. Oh my God, she murmured, and if there was any doubt in his mind that she had felt it too, it was quickly dismissed. She looked at him accusingly, her blue eyes wide, but he had no more explanation than she had. She babbled something about static electricity and weird engine misfires, and stumbled to the back of the plane. She couldn't go far, however, and Marcus knew, to the bottom of his soul, that somehow he would know exactly where she was for a good long while afterward. Chapter 3. Jessica sat on the low seat and stalled close to the rear of the plane, her knees pulled up to her chest. By her side, she kept her precious satchel of medical equipment and supplies. Every now and then, she reached out to touch it gently, taking some comfort in the sturdy canvas and nylon bag. Her mind was still spinning from the sensations that had shot through her when she and Marcus had touched, from the way that everything had lit up from just one moment. It was just some kind of static electricity zap. She told herself again. It was nothing. It meant nothing. Despite the rational solutions that her brain was desperately trying to grasp onto, there was a part of her that knew deep down it was all crap. It wasn't static electricity. It wasn't some weird misfire. It was something altogether different. Whatever it was, it had reached deep inside her to a place that had never been touched before. It sounded crazy, but it felt as if that electrical contact had awakened something inside her. After the heat of that touch had subsided, a restless hunger was left in its place, one that was only soothed for a moment when she glanced at the front of the plane where Marcus sat piloting calmly. The soothing only lasted for a moment, however, and then she was looking at his thick, sandy hair, the bronzed skin of his arms where he had rolled up his sleeves, the broad lines of his shoulders, and the powerful musculature of his. Jessica shook her head hard, because this was not an indulgence that she could afford. She had not come to Africa for a roll in the hay, and right now, she had absolutely no time for one. There were people counting on her. They needed her badly. No matter how good-looking Marcus Vanderberg was, she refused to think about him or what this strange, all-encompassing attraction meant. I don't know the man at all. That's dangerous enough when trying to date in New York City. In an unfamiliar country, traveling virtually alone into what could be some very perilous territory on a vitally important mission? Well, it would be ridiculous to be distracted by a stranger, wouldn't it? At the age of 27, this wasn't Jessica's first time in a foreign country, or even one as high risk as Tanzania. Her training made her uniquely suited for fieldwork for the WHO, and as the old adage went, she had gotten good at something, so they kept sending her out to get better at it. She had operated in Africa before, and getting her transportation from anyone who was willing to give it to her was old hat. She knew that Marcus was up to something, but she was willing to ignore it as long as he wasn't hurting anyone, and as long as he was transporting her where she needed to go. She was familiar with bumpy flights and turbulence, so the first time the plane bucked, she ignored it. The second, third, and fourth times, however, happened in such quick succession that she knew that something was up. She made sure that her bag was secured to the bench she'd been sitting on and made her way to the front of the plane. What's happening? She was not comforted by the fact that Marcus looked worried. Below them, she could see the stretch of green forest that was Tanzania's temperate zone, verdant green, and far closer to the underbelly of the plane than it should have been. Why are we flying so low? Good question, Marcus said tightly. I think the man who sold me this plane was right when he called it a bucket of bolts. And you bought it anyway? She asked, horrified. Hey, you didn't ask about it before you got on board either. I didn't buy the damn thing. She spat back, but then the plane lost a good 20 feet of altitude, clipping some tall trees before Marcus wrestled it back up. Quiet, he said through gritted teeth. I need to find out where I can put her down. We're going down? She might have said more, but Marcus pushed her down into the seat next to him. Buckle up. I think this is going to be a bumpy landing. No sooner had she gotten the straps buckled around her than the engine made an enormous coughing sound. It sounded as though the plane was grazing the treetops again, and she shouted as Marcus wrestled with the wheel. We're going down harder than I'd hoped, he growled. She had a mere moment to register his words, and then he was grabbing her, draping himself over her, his chest and arms covering as much as he could. The sudden drop in altitude left her stomach behind. Someone was screaming, and it took her a moment to realize that it was her. Jessica dug her nails into Marcus's thighs. He didn't flinch. He was whispering something in her ear, something that was meant to be comforting and soft, but the only thing that made her feel better was how tightly he held her. In the middle of her terror, as enormous crashing noises exploded all around them, she could feel the same electric heat that had occurred when they had touched earlier. Curled this close, practically under him, her body responded to his, and her craving for him intensified. Is this really what I'm thinking about moments before my death? She thought in dismay, but there it was. There was a terrible ripping sound that could only be one of the wings of the plane shearing off, and then Marcus was pulling away from her, back at the controls trying to take command of the plane again. She clung to him hard, but out of the corner of her eye, she could see green all around, something so unnatural to see surrounding the cockpit of a plane. The green was rushing past hard, barely slowing the plane's descent at all. For one delirious moment, she wondered if this was going to go on forever. And then as the base of an enormous tree appeared in front of her, she had her answer. There was a resounding crash, a feeling of extreme force being met by something that adamantly would not be moved. And then the world went dark. After impact, the first thing that Marcus realized was that every scent was much more intense. He smelled the steel of the plane, grateful there was no attendant scent of gasoline. He smelled the lush greenery of the jungle outside, and more than that, he smelled something breathtakingly delicious. The delicious smell came with a name, Jessica. He opened his eyes almost lazily to locate it. She was still strapped to the chair, slumped and unresponsive, but he could smell no injury on her. He was pressing his face close to her belly to get a better idea of her physical state when Marcus finally came back to himself. Fuck, I shifted, he thought, but even that thought was strangely fuzzy and distant. As a man, Marcus was tall, heavily muscled and strong. In his panther form, he was even bigger, enormous, and covered with sleek, thick, inky black fur. He was powerful enough to bring down an elk on his own. His paws could crush the life out of something smaller, and his claws could rip through flesh like it was butter. His panther form was formidable, and right now, still dazed by the crash, the human part of him wasn't sure that he could regain control. More than once, his hindbrain had perceived something as a threat and neutralized it with lethal intensity before his human brain had the chance to make a calculated decision. Base instinct had saved his life more than once, true, but now he was looking in horror at the woman who was passed out in such a vulnerable state in front of him. What if his panther thought she was a threat? God, what if his panther thought she was food? Before the real horror of that thought could sink in, she moved slightly, releasing a quiet moan. And she did awaken the beast's instinct. What the animal thought, however, was that she should not be bound. Acting on instinct, Marcus bit through her seatbelt neatly and pressed his body against her to help her slip safely to the floor. She weighed practically nothing, and in the smell of torn metal and ruptured greenery, there was something beautifully sweet and enchanting to her. Something about her scent and her touch soothed. Still dazed himself, Marcus settled down next to her, half under her body to cradle it, with one large killing paw settled protectively over her thigh. Jessica came to in increments, and the first thing that she was aware of was that everything hurt. She ached all over, but none of the pain was acute. It was only a dull and lingering ache, and as the memory of the crash surfaced, Jessica realized how lucky she was that she only felt achy. Oh God, what's happening? Where's Marcus? Her thoughts spinning, she tried to sit up, only to realize that there was a heavy weight on her. A heavy, furry weight. Jessica's scream caught in her throat as she saw the Black Panther looking up at her. Nothing human in the lambent light green eyes at all. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. At some point, Jessica was certain that she had received training for how one was supposed to behave when one was confronted by an enormous cat. Whatever she had learned was entirely lost from her mind right then, as she scrambled away. At any moment, she expected to feel a velvet weight pounce, 5-inch claws rake her body, razor-sharp teeth pierce her flesh. But there was nothing. She didn't stick around to ponder her good luck. The rear bay door of the plane was open, and as she dashed for it, she grabbed up her knapsack and medical bag full of sampling kits as well. Jessica shouted again as she pushed her way out of the plane. The door was 2 feet above the ground, and she just barely managed to avoid falling flat on her face. She righted herself with a curse and started to run. She needed to get away from the deadly predator that had been stalking her. She needed to find Marcus. Oh God, Marcus. What if the panther had eaten him? Was that why it hadn't killed her? Was its belly too full of Marcus? She had barely gone more than a few yards when she tripped again, this time knocking all the wind out of her chest. She rolled over on her back in time to see the panther drop gracefully out of the plane. It took a few steps towards her, and for a moment she was certain that she had survived a near-fatal plane crash, only to end up being mauled by a wild animal somewhere deep in the African jungle. Then, as she watched, the panther's silhouette, illuminated from behind by dappled sunlight, grew taller and then taller, and after a moment she realized that it was not just a change in stance. The panther was growing, stretching, shifting. The whole thing couldn't have taken more than a few moments, but where the panther had stood, now stood Marcus, buck naked. This has got to be real. My imagination isn't that good, she thought, taking in his entire and quite impressive nude form. This, on top of everything else, was simply too much. Jessica once again lost consciousness. Well, that's one way to deal with things, I guess, Marcus mumbled aloud. He was still dazed from the crash himself. Otherwise, he liked to think that he would have given her a better explanation for the panther. He might have even been able to remember to keep himself out of sight instead of dashing after her. Well, we play the cards we're dealt, he thought with a wince. He knelt next to Jessica and was relieved when he found her pulse to be fast and steady. It was shock then, rather than injury. She might have had a concussion, but that would be the worst of it. He lifted her in his arms, marveling for a moment at how right she felt cradled against his chest. He knew that he would be fine when night fell, but she was another story. Nights in the rainforests of Tanzania were cold and dangerous. As he felt the warmth of her body pressed against his, Marcus vowed that she would be protected. Chapter 4. Jessica awoke the second time, blinking and cursing. For a moment, she wondered why her bed in her New York City walk-up was so hard and uncomfortable. And then her memory rushed back to her. She remembered the crash. She remembered the way the wing had been ripped clean off the side of the plane. She remembered... No. That wasn't a real memory. Was it? She sat up and looked around, her panic only stalling out because her brain needed to figure out what was real and what was not. She was under some type of makeshift shelter, padded from the bare ground by a layer of switches laced together. It wasn't comfortable, but she guessed that was better than bare ground. Only a few feet away, there was a fire and a makeshift grill fashioned from a piece of metal that she guessed was taken from the wreckage of the plane. An Army-issue pot bubbled over it, and even as aching and exhausted as she was, she felt a pang of hunger go through her stomach. She had just started to wonder where Marcus was when she saw him approach through the darkness, appearing out of the thick foliage as if it was as familiar to him as her home in New York City was familiar to her. For a moment, she tried to convince herself that she had just imagined the panther. But when she saw a shimmering green glint in his eyes, she knew that she hadn't. There was a civilized part of her brain that might have tried to tell her that it was all a hallucination. But there was a part far more connected to an ancient, innate higher consciousness that told her in no uncertain terms that this man was a predator. Dangerous. All Marcus did, however, was smile gently at her, before squatting by the fire to give the meal a quick stir with a stick. If you're not too nauseated that you just throw this back up, you should try to eat, he said. I'm afraid we're short on bowls, but I have a spoon. If you come here, you can have as much as you like." He glanced at her, frowning when he saw that she hadn't moved from the shelter. "Is something wrong?" he said with a frown. "I checked you over. You didn't look hurt." "The panther," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "That was you." If she hadn't been coming off a plane crash and a period of dark unconsciousness, she might have been more circumspect, more cautious about uttering a truth that could have gotten her killed. Instead, all Jessica had was bluntness, and Marcus's breath hissed between his teeth. "You've been knocked around a lot today," he tried. "It makes sense that you might mistake a fever dream or some kind of hallucination for the truth, but surely you know how ridiculous that sounds." "It sounds ridiculous," she agreed, "but that doesn't change what I saw. I woke up, there was a panther who was lying down next to me, and the next thing I knew, that panther was transforming into you." "You had just fallen out of the plane hard," Marcus objected. "That's 2 hearty knocks in a row. You didn't know what you were looking at." "You were nowhere to be seen until you emerged out of that panther," she said softly, gazing right into his eyes. "If it wasn't you, how did you know I'd fallen out of the plane?" He hesitated and then closed his eyes. In that moment, he looked entirely human, and she could see that he was as exhausted as she was. For a moment, Jessica wanted to let him off the hook, however unwise that might have been. She wanted to take it back, or at least to ignore it, so that they could both get on with the business of surviving what had happened. "All right, you win," he said with a sigh. "Welcome to the conspiracy, I guess." She laughed a little, and somehow with that admission, she felt comfortable enough to crawl out of the lean-to and sit with him at the fire. "What are you?" she asked, and Marcus shot her a half-wry, half-amused smile. "You saw, didn't you? That's me." "I saw you change from a panther into a man," she retorted. "What does it mean? Have you always been able to do that? When you are a panther, are you still you?" "That's a lot of questions," Marcus said with a sigh. "Here, if you can eat at least half a bowl of this stuff, I'll answer what I can." Her stomach rumbled, settling the matter for her, and she ate willingly. There was a strange gamey taste to the meat, but it was covered with something that she thought might be some kind of local wild garlic. "It's good," she said with mild surprise, and he shrugged. "It's not hard to find food out here, not if you know what you're looking for. It's the desert where you start to get desperate. I was stuck in the desert once, and hunting was, well, let's say I ate a lot of rat." He laughed at the face she made, and then Jessica glanced down at the food that he had prepared. "Did you turn into a panther to hunt this for us?" Marcus hesitated for a moment, and she could tell that he was not a man who was very used to confessing private matters to other people. He reminded her of some of the military personnel she had known in the past, people who guarded their words and their pass with a nearly zealous fervor. However, there seemed to be something compelling Marcus to speak, and she wondered what that was, what could drive a man like him. "I did," he said. "There's a bit of a risk to it in some ways. The panther mind is a great tool. It lets me process all the things I'm smelling and feeling and hearing in the body. It lets me react far more quickly than I could as a man. However, there's a lot of instinct hardwired into it. The panther brain goes from scent to hunt to kill to eat. There's not much space to stop and say, no, let's bring this back to the fire, if that makes any sense. It's far easier for me to hunt as a panther but harder to prevent myself from eating what I've killed where I killed it. It made Jessica wonder about how safe she had truly been when she saw him shift from panther to man at the wreckage site. But she pushed the thought away. Right now, there were a dozen things threatening her safety, but for some reason, she didn't think that the man sitting next to her at a fire and feeding her was one of them. You talk about killing. It's not the panther killing things while you watch, like from the back of your mind? Marcus looked startled for a moment, and then he smiled ruefully. He was silent for such a long time that she started to feel nervous. I'm sorry, did I say something that I shouldn't have? You've hit on a very old question among my kind. Marcus responded. That's the question, isn't it? There isn't a one among us who can talk while we are in our animal bodies. We can sort of communicate, show that we don't like things, or that we do like things. We can understand others just fine, unless we can't. There are some among us who seem to be utterly bestial when in their animal forms. But is that just an excuse? No one can say for sure. He shrugged. For me, I know that my instincts are very strong, and that there are some things that instinct demands. At the end of the day, though, I am the one in control, which is a damned good thing because I am the one who has to deal with the consequences. There was a darkness to his words that made her wonder about those incidents where his instincts made demands. She knew better than to ask, however, and started a new line of questioning. And what about others? I guess it makes sense that you are not the only one of your kind. Again, he hesitated. She could tell that he was trying to figure out how much he should tell her. Of course, she thought. If there are any number of his people, it would only make sense that they live in secrecy. There are others, he said finally. It's hard to tell how many, but some of us live among you, pass as completely human, and many more live in our own secluded communities. I was heading to one of these communities before our plane took a nosedive. It's a hard thing to talk about. Jessica took a deep breath. I understand, she said. I've heard enough. Have you? He asked, regarding her with caution. She had a moment to wonder what in the world he expected her to do before she shrugged. As long as you're not trying to hurt me or to impair my mission, I'll keep the rest of my questions to myself. Besides, I have more important things to worry about than wondering about whether there are people turning into werepanthers in the dark. For a moment, she could see that Marcus didn't know what to do with that, and then he laughed. The sound was a low rumble that made her think of a purr, and something deep inside her shivered with pleasure. All right, then, he said. He eyed her quietly for a few moments, and then said softly, Fierce Jessica. It was the first time Marcus had called her by her name, and she felt a faint ghost of that electricity she had felt when they touched earlier. She shook it off, because if she couldn't afford an entanglement when everything was going well, she definitely couldn't afford one now that they were stranded in the jungle. They ate together in silence, and then she watched in fascination as he drained the last liquid from their meal into a small dish he fashioned from a broad leaf. Here, drink this. Plenty of nutrients to keep you strong. She might have objected to being fed like a baby, but a part of her simply wanted to obey, to stop thinking about all the bizarre occurrences building up around her like a drift of snow. She whimpered a little when he cupped the back of her head with his warm hand and tilted it back a little, but she drank the strong broth that he trickled into her mouth. It was uncommonly good, and she closed her eyes with a slight tremble when he pulled away. Her entire body felt electrified, almost overwhelmed at having him so very close. Animal magnetism. She thought was something close to fatigue and hysteria, and she started to laugh. What is it? Marcus asked her with a wary glance, and she knew she had to sound a bit like a madwoman. It's just... She tried to get the joke out, but the minor frustration at being unable to do so was the final straw. She had been running on autopilot ever since she had woken up after the plane crash. Every surprise, every added stress, simply sitting on top of the one that had come before. Now it all came toppling down, and she pressed her hands over her face. Too much. It was all too much. And in a matter of moments, her laughs had turned to sobs. It felt as if the entire world as she knew it was tumbling down around her, and there was absolutely nothing that she could do about it. She could sense Marcus's eyes on her for a moment, and then he wrapped his arms around her tightly. He was strong and powerful, and Jessica simply allowed herself to be held against him. She allowed herself to slip into the space of feeling protected and comforted by his presence. It's all right. You can cry if you need to, he murmured. It's all right. It's been, let's be fair, a shit day. But we'll get you where you need to go. It's all right. We'll get you where you're going. I promise. He went on saying things like that until her tears slacked off. It seemed like it took hours, but she knew logically that it was only a few minutes. When she sat up, she knuckled the last tears and grinned at him ruefully. You just spent the last few minutes telling me everything is going to be okay, without getting freaked out by the fact that I was crying, or telling me to stop. I think that actually makes you more of a rare creature than the turning into a were-panther thing. Marcus laughed at her. God, I hope not, he said. But if you're feeling better, we should bed down for the night. We've got some hiking to do, and I would rather do it on a full night's sleep. Oh, sounds like a good idea, I guess. She watched, feeling a little helpless as Marcus banked the fire and then indicated that she could get into the lean-to as he draped it with nylon mosquito netting. It wasn't high season for the dangerous little insects, but she knew they would be around sooner or later. She watched, her eyelids already drooping, as he set the netting and crawled in with her. It's going to get cold tonight, he said, nestling against her back as if they had done it for years. If I had a blanket, I might spare you this, but as it turns out, I do not. She giggled faintly. No worries. Besides, I don't think I have very much to worry about. After what we've just been through, I probably look like something that was dragged through the mud and then rolled in a haystack. She yawned. Not really feeling my most seductive or attractive right now. Well, I don't know about that, Marcus said mildly, and she could feel his face pressed briefly against the back of her neck. In a split second, their embrace had gone from comforting to sensual, awakening that need inside her again, that need to hang on to this man, to touch him and to pull him as close as he could get and never let go. Then the moment was over, and they both relaxed, a companionable silence falling over them. It really is going to be okay, he said, and she could hear the heaviness of his voice as he dropped off to sleep. Do you promise? He chuckled, sending slow and sleepy tingles up her back. I do promise, he said. I promise you, it will all be all right. Chapter 5. Jessica awoke with no idea where she was or why she was on the ground. But in seconds, memory reasserted itself. She sat up with a gasp, looking around and realizing that she was all alone under the lean-to. She stumbled out, eyes wide, but then she spotted Marcus ambling through the bush. carrying a large pack with ease and dropping it next to the fire. Despite everything that had happened, there was a part of her mind that could not help admiring how easily Marcus moved, how handsomely he was walking through the thin morning mist. He was a shockingly handsome man, and she had to shake her head to clear it before she crawled out of the lean-to. "Good morning," she said a little shyly. "Can I help?" "You can take down the mosquito netting," he said with a smile. "We're going to need that tonight. Other than that, as soon as I get our supplies organized, we can stuff some food in our faces and get going." She spied her bag of samples and medical equipment in the pile and breathed a sigh of relief. As long as she had that kit, everything was going to be fine. This wouldn't have all been a waste. Jessica turned to do as Marcus directed, folding the mosquito netting down tightly and tucking it into the small bag it came in. When she was done, she saw Marcus expertly sorting through the supplies, making a face that promised nothing good. "Everything all right?" she asked. "I mean, aside from the fact that we've crash-landed in the middle of rural Tanzania." He laughed at her words, shaking his head. "We're going to be all right. I promised you we would, and I don't make promises that I can't keep. However, I'll be honest, we could be doing better. We have the essentials. We have water purification tablets and a filtration system and canteens. We have a tent, and we even have a hammock in case we want to take it easy. There are a few MREs to eat, so at least we can starve slower. But the radio's trashed, and we're not going to get a signal out here at all. Looks like we're going to be hiking our way out." She flinched, because that wasn't good. But he was right. It could be far worse. "All right," she said. "I guess I'm ready to go when you are." "Well, first, let me introduce you to MREs. That'll make whatever I end up hunting down for dinner look amazing." Marcus had to admit that he hadn't expected a lot out of Jessica. She was a slight thing, even if the only thing she carried was the small knapsack and medical case of hers. When he saw her standing up after breakfast with the case slung over her shoulder, he had guessed that she might be ready to call it quits before noon. Jessica had surprised him, though. He let her set the pace, and she moved more slowly than he did, but that wasn't a surprise. As slow as she was, however, she persisted. She followed him, keeping her mouth shut, and listening when he warned her around trees and at one point a sleeping snake. When they stopped for a rest and a drink, she drank her portion without question or complaint, her eyes looking forward. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked finally, breaking the silence for the first time in an hour. "About the samples in my case and the people who need them," she said absently. "This might be the information we need to get the breakthrough. These people are struck with a terrible disease, and every moment I'm delayed in getting to them is another moment that someone is suffering, someone is dying, someone is losing someone else that they can't live without." She shot him a startled look. I'm not blaming you," she said hurriedly. "I mean, I don't think you like being lost in the woods any more than I do. And I don't think you're like being lazy about getting me where I need to go. I mean, you have your own issues, and..." He laughed at her, shaking his head. "Believe me, I take no offense, and if I could get you where you were going any more quickly, I would. I was only curious." "And what about where you're going?" He looked up, startled, and he found himself locked in her bright blue gaze. He had heard that werelynxes from the far north had eyes like that. Shining, gorgeous, and deadly. But they had nothing on Jessica. "Me?" "Yeah, you. I mean, at first when I met you, I thought that you were running guns or something like that. I mean, I figured you were doing something that we needed to stay quiet about. Now, though, I don't think that's it. So what is it? It's a private matter, and that's all I am going to say. His words came out a little harsh, making her flinch, and he cursed himself a little. It had been a while since he had spent any time with people not his own, and it showed. No, that's legitimate, she said, nodding. I didn't mean to pry, I was only curious. They got up to start moving again, and a thought occurred to him. So you were all right with getting into a plane with a man who might have been running guns? She shot him a grin that pulled at his heartstrings. Marcus almost reached out to touch her cheek right then, cupping her face and holding her still so he could kiss her. She was a beautiful woman, but when she smiled, it was like the sun coming out after a long, dreary day. Well, I need to get out to that village and get my samples, she said, slightly impish. Beyond that, well, I figure that's your business. As long as I don't get shot while you're giving me a lift, I tend not to complain much. Fierce, he said, shaking his head, and then he led them into the bush. When he had first laid eyes on her, Marcus had thought that she was not in any way his type. Too small, too short, too slender. However, now that he had spent some time with her, he knew that her beauty went far beyond the body she inhabited. He couldn't look at her face, into her bright eyes, without realizing how very gorgeous she was. To see her was to feel something deep inside him. It awakened a wanting inside him that he had thought long dead and gone. It made him desire things that he couldn't have, things he had not thought about in so very long. This is foolish. This is foolishness, he thought, and he tried to put the thought out of his mind. There was no value in it, there was nothing to be done about it, and all it would do was distract him from his mission. He was mostly successful, at least until the hyenas attacked. Jessica had once worked 20 hours straight in a raging storm, trying to get vaccinations passed out in a village in Rajasthan. And at that time, she had thought that she would never be more tired. She didn't think that she was quite that tired yet, but she was definitely getting close. She was reduced to putting one foot in front of the other, the strap from the samples case digging hard into her shoulder, and bumping against her hip with what felt like every step she was taking. Every article of clothing that she wore was soaked in sweat, and she was certain that her feet were so blistered that the only thing keeping her upright were her heavy boots. Still, all she had to do was follow Marcus. Marcus would get her where she needed to go. He would lead her, and because he had promised that things would be all right, they would be. In slightly more lucid moments, she wondered why she had put so much faith in him. She wondered how she could look at him, knowing everything that she did, about who he was and what he was, and still have this deep feeling of trust inside her. Really, just because a man can change into a panther is no reason to look at him like he hung the moon. She thought to herself, but there was more to it than that. She was still dissecting exactly what it was when she walked straight into his back. They had been walking along a surprisingly open part of the forest, the track relatively level and clear. After the steady pace that Marcus had set, she hadn't been watching where she was going. Jessica started to apologize, but then realized first that she hadn't budged him at all. God, how strong was he? And second, that he was standing stock still, gazing around at the forest surrounding them. Jessica bit back on the automatic question. She had been in enough emergency situations before to know that the best thing that an inexperienced person could do was be quiet until she got information. From the way that Marcus stiffened, she had an idea that this might be an emergency situation. There's something wrong, Marcus murmured, more to himself than to her. When he said that, she could hear it too, Or rather, she could not hear it. All the vivid birdsong, the movement of the small animals in the trees around them, the gentle ruffling of the underbrush, was quiet. The forest was too silent, and for a moment Jessica wanted to say something just to get it going. Then they both heard it at the same time. There was something moving through the underbrush, moving fast and sloppily, and along with it came a strange cackling noise that raised the hair on Jessica's neck. Marcus swore quietly, looking around and scanning the underbrush. "All right," he said, his voice deadly calm. "This is one of those situations where you need to listen to me without question. You understand?" "Yes," she whispered, her voice coming out more level than she had thought it would. "Yes, I understand." "Good girl. All right, we're going to start back towards that big rock behind you, and to the right. You know the one I'm talking about?" "Yes." It was a tall outcropping of rock jutting up into the trees. Covered with moss and vines, it looked as if it had been there for 1,000 years. Jessica guessed that it wasn't its age that Marcus cared about, so much as the fact that it was tall and wide. No one could come up behind them if they kept it at their backs. "All right, let's go. Be careful, but speed is good. Speed is very good right now." Jessica took a tighter grip on the satchel that held her sampling kit and walked in the direction that he had indicated. It wasn't that far away, just a dozen yards or so, but it felt like a few football fields. "Please, I don't want to die here," she thought. "I don't want Marcus to die here either." They had just made it to the stone when there was an explosion of motion in the jungle ahead of them, and a few large animals, stone gray and cackling like fiends, emerged. "Hyenas!" she choked out, but then there was a roar to her right. She had thought that Marcus as a man was fast and strong. It was nothing compared to what he was capable of as a panther. He shifted so quickly that she didn't even see the moment in between. 1 second he was a man, the next he was a panther. And the moment after that, he was launching himself at his foes. Frantic to do something, anything to help, Jessica slid her kit next to the rock and picked up a large tree branch. The moment she turned back to the flurry of violence in front of her, however, she knew that she would be of absolutely no use. There were at least 4 hyenas circling Marcus, tall and broad animals that were skilled pack hunters. They lunged at him, taking snaps that they pulled back from. They were testing his range, she realized with dread, seeing how far he could stretch out before leaving himself vulnerable to another hunter. The hyenas would draw things out until their prey was exhausted and making mistakes. Marcus, however, refused to allow them to do so. He let them test him for a moment, and she realized that it was only so he could put a little more distance between the vicious predators and the rock where Jessica was sheltering. Then Marcus lashed out like a hurricane, and with a single powerful blow, he crushed one hyena's head, and just as quickly lunged around to swipe long, sharp claws across another's face. They tried to draw back, trying to regroup and strike at him, but Marcus didn't let them. As Jessica watched in complete awe of his powers, he refused to back down. Marcus flung himself at his foes over and over again. He dispatched another with a powerful bite to the spine, but as he did so, one of the mangy beasts had circled to his side and bitten down hard on his foreleg. Marcus's roar of pain filled the forest, and he spun around, clubbing the offender down with sheer force, but the damage had been done. His leg dripped red with blood, and he faced his final opponent, the biggest and smartest on 3 legs. This one, alone now, played a different game. It danced just outside of Marcus's reach, forcing him to extend himself farther and farther over that injured leg. It circled him over and over, and from where she stood clutching her branch tightly, She could see he was wearing out. All it would take was the panther being just a little too slow, just a little too sluggish, and it would be over. Unless the hyena is distracted. Jessica knew how hopelessly outclassed she was when it came to animals that were at the top of the food chain. She knew that even the weakest hyenas could likely tear her limb from limb. It didn't matter. If she didn't do something soon, Marcus might. She couldn't think about it. Instead, she acted. Jessica strode forward just as the hyena stood between her position and Marcus. Realistically, it was the most dangerous place that she could be standing right then. If the hyena made a lunge for her, there would be absolutely nothing that Marcus could do about it. Taking a deep breath, she brought the end of the branch sweeping across the hyena's rear legs. The thing was too heavy to be knocked off its feet, but it buckled for a moment before turning on her with a snarl. She could see its enormous dog-like teeth, the anger and fury in its eyes. And then with a roar, Marcus was on top of it. His final killing lunge had none of the elegance or grace that he had had before. This was a desperate animal's last-ditch fight for survival, but fortunately, it worked. The hyena went down with a final shriek, and then silence returned to the clearing. The branch fell from Jessica's numb fingers, and she slid to her knees in exhaustion. "Marcus?" The name fell out of her mouth, and the panther looked at her. Marcus's words echoed in her ears, and she wondered who was in control now, man or beast. She wondered if the beast had any compassion for her, if the man had enough strength to protect her if it did not. Then with a blurring that was hard for her mind to understand, the panther disappeared, and there was only a naked man in front of her, crouched on the ground, looking exhausted with a bloody arm. To Jessica's surprise, he grinned at her, and there was something savagely proud in that grin. "I told you to stay put," he said, but he couldn't keep the laughter from his voice. "I decided I knew better," she retorted, and the sound of his laughter bellowed through the clearing. Chapter 6. Neither of them could stomach staying in that clearing, next to the dead hyenas. But their mutual exhaustion wouldn't take them that far either. Before Jessica would agree to take another step, however, she insisted on tending to Marcus's arm. "It's going to be fine," he said. "My kind heal very quickly. In a week or so, it's just going to be an ugly scar that doesn't bother me at all." "Okay, but right now it's an open wound that is going to attract all sorts of nastiness. Here, stop being such a hero and let me tend to it." For a few minutes, she was so busy washing out the wound and disinfecting it with their decades-old first aid kit that she wasn't aware of anything else, until suddenly she realized that she was tending to a patient who was not only sexy as all get out, but very naked. She couldn't stop a blush from rising to her cheeks. She guessed that Marcus could tell what she was thinking, because despite flinching from her touch, he chuckled a little. "What have you got on your mind?" he asked innocently. "Whatever it is, it looks entertaining." It's about the fact that you're naked," she muttered. Does that happen every time?" "I'm afraid so. Some of the other shifters have forms smaller than their human bodies, and they get off a little better." "You probably shouldn't be naked going through the jungle," she said, and he nodded. "I don't have any more tactical gear, more's the shame, but I have an extra pair of pants in my pack. Might even have a shirt, though that's a little less likely." As it turned out, after she had patched him up as best she could, he dug out a t-shirt, a pair of running shoes, and a pair of ancient jeans. He made a face after he put them on, and she laughed. "You look like some guy from Brooklyn on your way to get some artisan yogurt or something," she teased, and he sighed. Honestly, I'm not exactly sure what artisan yogurt is, but I might try it. Let's get out of here. I'm ready to be away from this mess. They walked for an hour or so, but after just a few minutes, Jessica could see that Marcus's injuries were getting the best of him. He appeared to be fading fast. He stumbled more, and his gait had slowed. Before, she had guessed that he was deferring to her, but now she could tell that he was just exhausted. When they reached a small stream, they paused to rest, and Jessica determined it was time to put a stop to this. "All right, executive decision time," she said. "We're stopping here for the night." He glanced at her with a frown. "There's still plenty of daylight," he said, and with a feeling of dismay, she could tell he was going to argue with her. If he got his way, he would be marching with an injury, possibly losing more blood and getting weaker all the while, and she refused to think about what that might mean, quick healing or no. "Well, yes, but there's a stream here," she said, pointing, "and some shelter among those rocks, and honestly, I'm really sorry, Marcus, but I'm exhausted. I'm not sure how much farther I can go." She had a feeling that if he were a little more alert and aware, she never would have gotten away with that tiny fib. Instead, the moment she mentioned that she was tired, Marcus couldn't begin to set up camp soon enough. He wouldn't allow her to prepare the lean-to or set up the mosquito netting, but he at least let her rove the immediate area looking for firewood for the night. She thought that they would simply prepare their rationed MREs. She was startled when she saw Marcus select a long straight branch from a nearby tree. He snapped it off with a casual strength that should have been terrifying, and with a few strokes of an enormous knife, he put a sharp point on it. "What are you doing?" she asked, and he grinned. "I thought I would catch us some dinner," he said, and Jessica decided that she had had enough. "No, you are not," she said, loudly enough that he looked at her in surprise. "You are not doing one more thing tonight that is going to aggravate your arm or prompt more blood loss. You are not going to go throwing a spear into the water and trying to wrestle with whatever you pull out of it." "I'm not." "You are not," Jessica said sternly. "Give me the spear." "Okay, but whoever carries the spear is in charge of getting us dinner," he said, amusement lurking in his bright eyes. At that point, she was well past caring, and she held out her hand for the spear. The moment he put it in her hands, she could feel how heavy it was, and she started to wonder if she had made a bad decision. He settled on the bank to watch her, and refusing to be daunted, she marched out to the water, where the bright afternoon light would make it easier to see the fish she was supposedly trying to spear. She tucked the ends of her long skirt into her waistband and kicked off her shoes. There were no open cuts on her feet, so she probably wouldn't have to worry about parasites. And taking a deep breath, Jessica stepped into the water. "Ah!" The jungle was sweltering, but the stream, likely fed from the meltwater in the mountains to the north, was frigid. She waited, teeth clenched, for her skin to get acclimated to the temperature, and the whole time she could feel Marcus's amused glance at her back. "Want me to take over?" he called, and she could have snarled at him. "I don't give up so easily," she retorted. "Stand with your feet planted, and balance the spear in your hand," he said. "Remember that you are stabbing, not throwing, and that you want to adjust for the fact that the water bends your vision. The fish isn't where it looks like it is." It was good advice, at least, even if her first half-dozen thrusts netted her nothing but splashing water and a glimpse of a frightened fish lunging away. Her seventh attempt, Jessica overbalanced and ended up in the water herself. And the only thing that made it even marginally acceptable was Marcus's roaring laughter from the bank. He had lost the drawn and stern look he had worn while they were marching through the woods, and she had to assume that his wound was healing after all. "Yeah, laugh it up," she called, and he shrugged. "Anytime you want me to take over, I will," he said, and she turned back to the water. Her 10th try netted nothing. Her 15th was similar. However, sometime after she lost count, when her body was aching with the strain of holding still, and when she was wondering if she could just try to net the fish with her skirt instead, her spear made contact, and suddenly there was a wiggling fish the size of her forearm on the end of her spear. "Oh my God!" she yelped, because she had honestly not thought this far ahead. It had seemed an unlikely enough procedure that she would land a fish in the first place, and now that it happened, she had no idea how to proceed. "Scooping motion!" shouted Marcus, standing up from his seat. "Down to get the spear in, and up to toss it on the bank." Gulping, she did as he said, half expecting to see the fish squirm away no matter what she did. Somehow, miraculously, the fish went flying through the air to land half in the water and half on the bank. It might have fallen back into the water, but Marcus was there in a flash, scooping it up with powerful hands. "Is it good?" she asked anxiously, coming in from the water. "Is it dinner?" At some point her stomach had started crying to be fed, and she could feel the pangs claw at her when she wasn't distracted. "Unfortunately, no," he said with a frown. "This one's toxic to humans." Jessica could feel her eyes well with tears that she struggled to hold back. For God's sake, she would not be a baby about this. There were MREs, and Marcus probably could fish if he had to, and... "Oh, sweetheart, don't look like that. I was joking. It's fine. It's perfectly fine, I promise." For a moment, Jessica could not understand the words that Marcus was saying. Then the meaning set in, and she dropped the spear, launching herself straight for him. "You bastard! I was doing that to make sure you didn't hurt your damn arm. I was so worried you were going to hurt yourself, and I'm soaking wet, and I'm exhausted, and you tell me that it's poisonous?" Marcus's laugh was deep and sonorous, rolling over her like the tone of a golden bell. In the fading light, she could see his eyes glow with pleasure and amusement, and she stepped back. She had to. Otherwise, she might lean in too far towards that preternatural warmth. Who knew what might happen after that? Can we get this cooked?" "We can," he said softly. To her relief, he didn't question her brief pause. He was able to scale the fish and gut it while directing her to get the fire started, and soon enough it was spitted over the crackling flames. As the fish cooked over the fire, Jessica flopped down on the ground. It was hard underneath her, and if she lay still too long, it would start to bruise her. But right then she was too tired to care. "It really will be okay," Marcus said. "I promise you, I'll make sure that you're okay." Jessica was too tired to do much more than smile at him, barely turning her head. "That's not even what I was thinking about. I mean, I am going to be very grateful if you get me out of this. But if for some reason you can't, you need to get this gear to the village I was going to. They need these samples back in the city. The WHO needs them. If you have to make the call, that's the one to make." Marcus frowned at her. "There is no way that I'm going to value some medical gear over..." She propped herself up on one elbow, looking at him narrowly. "That's what's going to happen," she said. "Marcus, promise me. These are important. I am too, but when it comes to furthering the understanding of the disease and how it's working on people, that's the call you need to make. I need to know that's the call that you are going to make." "Jessica, Please, don't." To her surprise, Marcus's expression looked disturbed, and he reached out a hand to fold over hers. His touch sent those indescribable tingles through her again. Though it was hard, she drew her hand away. She looked into his eyes, trying to convey how important this was to her, how essential this was to the fate of the people in the region. She needed him to be absolutely clear on what her needs were. Their eyes locked, and he was the one who looked away first. "All right," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "All right." He shook his head, turning towards the fish to give it an unnecessary poke with his knife. "You are one hell of a woman, Jessica," was all he was willing to say. When the fish was cooked to Marcus's satisfaction, he deftly pulled it off the spit and cut it in two. There were no plates, but he found 2 large, waxy green leaves to serve them on. Jessica was very nearly brought to tears again when she took her first bite of the fish. The meat was thin and scanty, and she had to carefully eat her way around the pale needle-like bones, but she thought it was perhaps the best fish she had ever eaten. It wasn't until she had finished her portion that Jessica looked at Marcus guiltily. You need more food than I do, and we split this down the middle." Marcus chuckled. "After that joke about the toxic fish, I've lost all right to make any demands like that. And as I said, my kind heal fast. By tomorrow night, I'll be back in fighting condition. I might not be very elegant about it, but I can get us fed, not to worry." Jessica was surprised to feel her eyelids droop as the sun fell below the horizon. "I don't know why I'm so tired," she complained, and Marcus laughed again as he banked the fire to last through the night. "It's being in the bush," he said. "I have a friend that says that the wilds turn us all into birds. We rise early, we sleep early. You'll probably wake at dawn and feel drowsy again at midday. This is what people did at the dawn of their history." "Their history? Do you not think of it as your history?" she asked, and he thought for a moment. "That's complicated," he said, "and not something that I really should talk about." "Oh, I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't—" "It's all right." Marcus felt strong enough to make them a bed, weaving together thin branches to offer them some padding from the increasingly cold ground. He found a way to drape the mosquito netting so it hung around the bower. From her place close to the fire, Jessica thought that there was something lovely about it. It was something that a knight might build for his lady fair, and she smiled a little at that thought. "We should sleep," he said. "Then we'll be ready to march as soon as it becomes light." Jessica felt a light blush creep over her face as she realized how closely they would be sleeping. She knew that there was no choice, and when Marcus told her that the bed was ready, she crawled onto the branches. She lay stiffly on her side as Marcus readied their camp for the darkness. There was a part of her that liked listening to the soft sounds he made as he moved around her. She knew that they were still in a great deal of danger, but somehow being able to hear him made her feel oddly safe. Marcus was with her. Everything was going to be all right. She flinched a little when he came to lie down behind her. She might have been stiff, but Marcus had no similar doubts. He lay close to her, her back to his chest, and he threw an arm over her waist as if they had slept together for years. "We need to stay warm," he explained. "The fire isn't going to last, not without our gathering a lot more wood, and it's the wrong time of year to find dry wood anyway. This is the next best thing." I am not so sure it is," she said, trying to joke. "I mean, I think the next best thing might be a room at one of the big hotels in New York, you know? With a hot tub and room service, and a view." Marcus chuckled, a warm sound right next to her ear. She shivered as the sound sent a pleasant thrill through her body. Well, I'll admit that in general, camping is a little more relaxing when you don't have to do it on behalf of the World Health Organization. When you're up in the Rockies and the sky is clear for 200 miles in all directions, that's beautiful. I hope I get to see it someday, she said before she remembered that her time with Marcus was a limited engagement. Despite her powerful attraction to him, she could not afford falling in love or making a commitment, not if she was to do all the good that she wanted to do. I hope you do as well, he said quietly. They drifted off to sleep then, and Jessica fell into a thin, uneasy slumber. She was running from something that giggled with a madman's cackle in the night. She knew that if she simply made it to the village, she would be safe. But when she got there, the gates were barred against her, and the villagers drove her away with shouts and stones. Jessica woke with a start. The last light was fading from the banked fire, and all around her was a deeper darkness than any she had ever known. She might have been flying through space without any idea of what was in the future or the past. Nothing held her to the earth except for the bed of branches underneath her and the man who held her in his arms. She stirred and his arms tightened around her. Instead of feeling restrained or threatened, it sent a spear of desire straight to her core. She bit her lip, trying to stay still, but behind her she could feel Marcus's bulk, his warmth against the cold of the world. Her slight shiver turned into a full-on squirm as his hands roved fitfully over her belly and her thighs. He made a low growling sound in his sleep, almost a purr. Biting her lip, unable to help herself, Jessica pressed herself back against him. She knew that she was playing with fire, but there were some things that were more powerful than her doubts and her fears. There was a need inside her that begged to be quelled, and a part of her was tired of being without him. She could feel Marcus wake up suddenly, going perfectly still with one hand right under her soft breasts, the other slightly lower. He froze for a moment, and then she felt him grind against her, his body tensing. When she pressed back against him, he groaned and pressed his mouth against the back of her neck. She trembled when she felt the brush of sharp teeth against her nape. Her hands flew up to fit over his, but instead of pulling them away, she pressed them closer. "Jessica," Marcus said, a note of urgency in his voice. "Jessica, are you?" "Yes," she murmured, because out of her exhaustion and the adrenaline that had been keeping her going, sprang fiery desire low in her belly. "Yes, please, I need... Marcus didn't wait to hear the rest of her stuttering confession. He pulled back just enough to turn her over, and then it didn't matter that she couldn't see him because he was pulling her close for a kiss. It was like nothing she had ever encountered before. All need and teeth, and behind it, a desperate restraint. Somehow she could tell that he wanted her safe, couldn't stand the thought of hurting her. In response, she threw her arms around him, kissing him just as wildly as he kissed her. She could feel the muscles that slathered his frame, feel the way they tensed underneath her touch. She held on to him tightly, insinuating her body against his. She could feel his manhood hardening between them, drawing a response from her body that was almost too powerful for her to understand. Marcus groaned, his hands sweeping from her waist up to her shoulders. One hand landed in her hair, tightening just hard enough to make her gasp, and the other swept down to her rear, squeezing gently. He cut off her soft cry with another kiss, and this time he pressed his tongue past the seam of her lips. She could feel the velvet wetness of his mouth against hers. Jessica drew his tongue deeper into her mouth, suckling gently and drawing a moan from him. "I want you," she whimpered, and then it was as if a dam had broken. With a deep growl, Marcus rolled up over her, trapping her legs together with his knees planted on either side of hers. "I need you naked," he growled. "I can't stand it when you're clothed. God, sometimes it's all that I can think about." She only had a moment to puzzle over that before he pulled back just far enough to grip a handful of her shirt in his fist. With a hard tearing motion, he ripped the shirt from her shoulders, leaving her wearing only her bra. With another yank, he pulled down her skirt as well, her panties joining them. For a moment, in shock, she tried to cover herself, but he grabbed her wrists and pinned them over her head. She cried out a little at his hard grip. She knew instinctively that she could struggle all she liked, but she could no more move against him than she could an iron shackle. "You are so perfect," he growled, leaning down to kiss her. He started at the point of her jaw and then moved down to her throat, where her pulse fluttered like that of a prey animal brought to bay. He measured her pulse with his soft lips for a moment, and Jessica felt a shudder roll through her. He laughed a little, as if he could guess her thoughts, and she could feel him smile as his kisses trailed down to her tender collarbones. She shivered, and then his fingertips traced over the lacy edge of her bra. "Please don't tear my bra," she murmured, and he laughed. "As the beautiful lady wishes." He let her sit up, and then his arms went around her, plucking at the hooks of her bra. Jessica gasped as he pulled away her last garment. She resisted the urge to cover herself with her arms, and then Marcus was lying her back on their makeshift bed. "It's so dark," she whispered. "Can you see anything at all?" "I can see just fine," Marcus murmured. "I can see that you are exquisite. I can see that you are tired and afraid. I can see that you want me, and God above the men and the beasts, I want you as well." When he knelt to start kissing her again, he was still straining with need, but there was something almost reverent about the way he ran his hands down her flanks, how he kissed the very center of her sternum. When Jessica reached for him, he lightly pinned her hands to her sides. "I want to feel you," he murmured, just the hint of a growl in his voice, and she trembled. He started with his hands, running them up and down her body, resting them briefly against her wrists, her throat, her ribs. He brushed his hands over her breasts, teasing the peaks until they were hard and straining. He waited until she was writhing gently under his touch, before he lowered his head to her breast. Jessica felt his teeth brush against the straining tips of her breasts, teasing them and taunting them until she thought she might go insane. "What would you do if I told you that you were allowed to bite me?" she whispered, and Marcus laughed, a harsh sound. "You should not do that," he said softly. "That would be unwise." It only tempted her to it more, but then he was shifting, kneeling between her legs and spreading her thighs apart. She closed her eyes, draping her arm over her face in embarrassment. In the dark, she had no idea how well he could see her, but it didn't matter. No man had ever looked at her so closely or with such obvious hunger. "God, you are beautiful," he said again, and he dipped his head down to her belly. In that moment, when he grazed his teeth over the skin of her stomach, when his powerful body crouched down over hers, she knew that he was a predator. Jessica had seen him transform, and she knew that he could hunt just like any other big cat. But now her hindbrain knew as well. There was a part of her descended from people who had crouched in the dark, afraid of the sharp-toothed predators. and that part of her knew that he was one of them. It should have sent her screaming into the night, trying to get away from him with everything she had, lest she be devoured as well. Right now, however, it only made her want him more, and it was a struggle to surrender to him, to allow him to kiss her while keeping her arms down by her sides where he had left them. Marcus made soft noises of satisfaction as he kissed his way past her hip bones and down to her thighs. Though his hands passed achingly lightly over the dark fluff between her legs, his mouth never went close. Her body arched up against his touch, but he teased her mercilessly. Once or twice he pressed the base of his palm against her dampening flesh, but he drew it away again just as easily. "Please," she found herself saying. "Please, Marcus." She wasn't sure why he finally gave in. She thought that there was a chance that he would simply tease her forever, leaving her a shivering, shuddering wreck in the heart of the jungle. Then suddenly he shifted down, moving his body until his head was pillowed against her thigh. There was something strangely sacred about the moment, as if they were taking part in something that people had been doing since the dawn of time. "You need me?" he asked, his voice hushed. "You want me?" "Yes, yes," she cried, and he needed no further prompting. He spread her legs wider with his hands, and then he kissed his way up to the secret tuft of fur between her legs. He spread her open to reveal the sensitive flesh there, and at the first touch of his tongue, she whimpered wildly. The heat that had been rolling through her intensified with every stroke of his tongue on her clit, and every teasing fingertip down at her wet entrance below. There was something ravenous about the way he laid his mouth to her, as if he wanted to eat her whole. She tried to focus on Marcus and what he was doing, but the waves of pleasure that started to wash over her were far too strong. She shuddered, her belly lurching, as he pushed higher and higher, harder and harder. "Oh! Oh, please!" she cried, and he laughed, a vicious sound in the wild darkness. "Another time, I will make you beg," he growled. "I want to hear you plead for the release that I can give you. Now, I cannot wait." She started to ask him what that meant, but then his mouth was moving against her flesh again, working her hard and leaving no room for anything like words or doubts. She couldn't leave her hands down at her sides. Instead, they came up to bury themselves in his hair. She could feel the muscles of her thighs tightening and tensing. It was almost painful, but it was far less important than the way he was stroking her most tender flesh. She was torn between wanting to try to get away from the intensity and wanting more of it. In the end, all she could do was shudder under his touch. Her body wound tighter and tighter, until all at once ripples of sensation started to tear through her. Each one was more powerful than the last, and she was shaking so hard she had to drum her heels into the ground underneath her. She was writhing, held only to earth by his powerful hands on her hips, and then she convulsed wildly, the pleasure simply too great to be constrained by her frame. Jessica scrunched her eyes shut, listening to her own cries echo through the forest as if they belonged to someone else. The pleasure that coursed through her was so intense that she could barely process it, let alone understand it. She had made love to men before, but it had never been like this. There was something beautiful and primal at work, and when Marcus pulled back, Jessica wailed out loud. Her climax was still pulsing through her body, making her shiver, when he rose over her. He blocked out the faint light from the fire, from the stars above, and for a moment she thought of gods come out of the jungle, ready to take what was theirs by the right of tooth and claw. With a growl that barely sounded human, Marcus lowered himself to her waiting body. For a moment, she thought that she would be far too tired and wrung out to take him without pain. But when she felt the blunt tip of his cock pressing against her entrance, she knew that she was ready for him. "I want you," she whispered nakedly, and he responded with a soft sound that was nearly wounded. "I don't understand how I can crave you this much," he replied, but before she could scrutinize his confession, he was pressing inside her. She whimpered as he entered her, but Marcus had absolutely no mercy as he sheathed himself with her body. His entry was smooth and slick, perfect. When Marcus was settled completely inside her, she opened her eyes to look up at him. She caught a gleaming flash of his gaze, and then he was thrusting into her. His motions started out slowly, but she could tell that he had held off too long for it to last. He was trembling with need just as she had been, and suddenly she did not want him to torture himself any longer. Jessica reached up to rake her nails down along his back, and when he groaned, she did it again. "Don't stop yourself," she said, her voice high and breathy. "I want all of you. Please." On that please, she could feel something inside Marcus shatter. He reared up slightly, taking her hips in his hands and dragging her towards him. He handled her as if she were as light as a leaf blowing on the jungle breeze. She felt lost in the storm of his passion, surrounded by his ferocity, his breath, his heat. Jessica clung to him as his thrust turned desperate, and with a deep growl, he thrust into her one last time. His teeth found the sensitive joint between her shoulder and her neck, the eroticism of the bite mingling with the feeling of satiation in her as he spilled in her body. Jessica was a woman of science, and though she studied the world, she had never quite felt herself a part of it. Tonight was different. Lying in the heart of a pristine jungle, Marcus above her and earth below her, she knew that she was as part of the world as the trees, the water, and the beasts that stalked the night. She clung to Marcus hard, letting him shake until he went still. When he pulled away from her, she protested, but he only chuckled, moving a short distance away. He returned swiftly with a rag drenched in water, and Jessica's protest turned to a soft purr as he started to clean her from head to foot. "You're a scientist. You should know how important it is to stay clean in the jungle," he said, a soft hint of humor in his voice. "I'm a scientist who never thought that people could turn into wild animals either," she retorted. "I think I can be excused for forgetting. Oh!" Jessica's eyes fluttered closed as he started to clean her between her legs. His touch light with just a hint of sensuality. It was a distraction, she supposed, but it felt far too good to make him stop. "I shouldn't have bitten you so hard," he said, ruefully, touching the spot on her neck. It was slightly sensitive with a lush throbbing sensation that made her feel oddly needy again. "I don't mind," she said, and he sighed. "You should," he said, and would say no more. Chapter 7. Jessica wasn't sure she had ever been as tired and achy as she was by the time they made camp the next day. Marcus had roused her at dawn, denying her protest for just another few hours of sleep. "The more miles we can trek, the sooner we get where we need to be," he said. "Come on, sleepyhead." He had set a pace that felt just short of punishing to her, but the promise of a camp and civilization kept her going. "How in the world do you know where we are going?" she asked him during their midday break. "No compass, no map. People have died for less in the bush." He gave her a look that was more than a little smug. "I can find my way just fine," he said, and when she shot him a skeptical look, he laughed. "Humans think that the only way to navigate the world is with their eyes. They never think that their cities, even their villages, have smells that can be tracked across the thickest of jungles." Jessica stared at him. "You mean you're smelling a town?" He shrugged. "I smell fire and wood smoke. I smell the burn of electronics and mud brick and cultivated plants. It's as different from the jungle sense as night and day. It's like being in a dark room and moving towards a glint of light. I'm not sure I can explain better than that." She wondered how much wider the world must be for Marcus, how very much more there was for him to experience. Suddenly, Jessica felt oddly self-conscious. "So, I guess you can smell the fact that I haven't bathed in days." Marcus, in the middle of checking his pack, looked up at her startled, and then the look he gave her was frankly predatory. "I think you smell utterly delicious," he said, and Jessica blushed to the roots of her hair. She started to sputter a response, but Marcus was already rising. "Come on, we've got a long way to go before we rest tonight." When they finally made camp, Jessica collapsed in a boneless heap under the shelter that Marcus had erected. She had helped build it because she would be damned if she turned into a damsel in distress, but she suspected that Marcus had done the brunt of the work. "Stay where you are and tend the fire," Marcus said, stepping out of his clothes as casually as if he were in a New York dressing room. "Rest. I'll come back with something to eat." She had waved him off because frankly she did not have the energy to do much else. And then he had melted into the shadows of the dimming jungle like a ghost. Jessica guessed that if she was a little more tired or a little more well-fed, her mind would have been spinning. Marcus was not a human, and the heights of pleasure he had given her, well, that was inhuman as well. Even as she lay exhausted on the bed of woven branches Marcus had constructed, Jessica couldn't stop her hand from venturing to the small bruise on her neck, where he had bitten her. It was a primal gesture, and what did it say about her that she loved it? Jessica was almost on the verge of sleep when she realized that the light of the fire had died down. "Oh, is the fire going out?" She staggered up on her elbow to inspect, and then she realized that her problems were a lot bigger than a dying fire. As a matter of fact, her new problem seemed to be 15 feet long and covered in green scales, with dark patches running up its thick body. Anaconda. She thought blankly. What in the hell is a South American snake doing in Africa? She sat up slowly, realizing that the snake was rearing back until its head was nearly level with hers. There was a strange intelligence in its dark eyes, and Jessica half wondered if she could hear a nearly human voice in its soft hiss. "Shh. I need to move slowly," she thought. "I'm not its natural prey. It was probably just drawn to the fire. Maybe it's an escapee from a private collection, or..." The anaconda moved like water, smooth and swift, and in a heartbeat its head shot forward, the weight of that heavy body behind it. The hard nose hit the center of Jessica's chest like a punch, and when she toppled on her back, the weight of the snake quickly settled on top of her. Jessica screamed, shoving at the thick coils desperately, but the snake was far too heavy for her to budge. The coils were ridiculously strong, made of muscle, and as they coiled around her tightly, she could feel her vision going dark. In the jungle, Marcus raised his head, startled and confused. The twilight birds were still singing, the wind was blowing, and underneath his perch in a tree, a small wild pig was still snorting happily at its grubs. By all rights, nothing could distract a hunting cat, but something was wrong. He hesitated, but then it came again, a scream, but one he could only hear in his mind. This time he recognized it. Jessica. Something far stronger than his instincts took over. With a bound, he had left the happy pig behind and he was vaulting down to the forest floor, racing with the breakneck speed and graceful efficiency of a big cat whose life was on the line. When he was in his cat form, everything usually felt simpler, cleaner, and purer. Emotions were simplified, and very few things were more important than food and rest. Now, though, it was as if someone had poured pure terror over his heart, and Marcus ran with the swiftness of one possessed. He rushed back into the camp, and in a second took in the scene, his lover unconscious, and a dark green snake coiled around her, squeezing the life out of her. He roared, ready to fling himself across the clearing towards them, but the snake twisted towards him, ready to face a new threat. Anaconda. His human brain supplied in confusion, but not just an anaconda. Moving with a liquid speed that made them among the most feared predators in South America, the snake relinquished its hold on Jessica. He had just a relieved moment to see that she was still breathing, and then the snake was rearing back, rising higher and changing at the same time. In a moment, instead of a snake, there stood a naked woman with ice-white hair and blue chips of ice for eyes. She was as plump as the snake had been, and like the snake, she had no mercy at all. With a snarl that stayed on his face even in his human shape, Marcus shifted to meet her. "Sophie," he said, "you're far from home." Her lips curved into a smile that was far from pleasant, and a part of him shivered at how very foreign snakes were from anything with fur or feathers, how alien their minds and their needs. "Some good way," she agreed, her voice soft as a hiss in the grass. "And you are looking quite handsome yourself, Marcus. But I can't approve of your taste in lunch." She pressed her bare toe against the unconscious Jessica's ribs to make her point, and Marcus could feel a snarl rising in his chest. "Don't touch her," he growled. "If you harm her, I swear I will rip your head from your body." Sophie smiled at him as if he had said something funny, and obligingly stepped away from the prone woman on the ground. "Those are a lot of big words for a man who has hampered himself with a human while trying to escape from my people," she said, her voice lightly taunting. "I may not be able to take you on, but one human woman tending a fire in the woods, that's almost criminally easy." Marcus could feel the ache in his spine and his hands that told him the feline in him was ramping up to a rage. He knew that snakes were meant to have sly tongues on top of all the danger in their bodies. They were tricksters, always had been, and he knew that she was no less a danger to Jessica just because she was human and naked. "You need to leave," he said. "Leave and never return, because if you do, I swear I will make you regret it." Sophie smiled at him, and she opened her mouth as if she was going to say something. Instead, she made a stabbing motion at Jessica, and before Marcus even realized that her hand must be empty, he howled, lunging through the fire at her. Of course, there was nothing in her hand. She was as naked as he was when he transformed. Instead, all that was left was the echo of her mocking laughter as she shifted down into animal form and slithered into the darkness of the jungle behind her. Marcus fought down the instinctive urge to chase her, because in the underbrush, she would be the one with the advantage. In the clearing, he would have beaten her handily, but in the darkness of the undergrowth, there were a dozen ways she could have attacked him. Instead, he turned his attention to Jessica, who was regaining consciousness with a groan. He held her protectively in his arms as she awakened, and for a moment she blinked fuzzily at him. A slight smile strayed across her face, but then her eyes widened in fear. "Snake!" she cried out, sitting up straight. "Snake! There was a—" "Yes," Marcus said, holding her still in his lap. There was a very masculine part of him that insisted on noting that he was naked while she was squirming on top of him. But this was certainly not the time, no matter how delicious she was. "There was a snake. She's gone now, though." "She?" Jessica looked at him in bewilderment. "That was an anaconda. It had no business being in Africa at all. Are you telling me that snake was, a shifter like you?" Marcus's unhappy look made Jessica tense even more, and he winced as she dug her nails into his arms. You're not telling me something." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow I'll tell you everything I should have told you before. Now, though, we need to get somewhere safe. We need to get somewhere safe." When Jessica realized where somewhere safe was meant to be, she thought that she would have rather braved the anaconda. Instead, she took a deep breath and clung to Marcus's shoulders as he climbed the tallest tree that he could find. She shut her eyes as they left the forest floor far below, and she clung to the tree trunk when he deposited her on a large branch. Slightly above where Jessica sat, Marcus strung a hammock from branches that looked far too thin to hold their weight. "All right, sweetheart. Just trust me. In another minute, you'll be sleeping like a baby." She only whimpered, not looking down at the forest floor, as he lifted her again and placed her into the nylon hammock. The branches holding the hammock dipped slightly and then held, and Jessica only whimpered a little when the hammock started to sway. She regained enough courage to crack an eye open and spot Marcus. He was sitting on a branch close by, as casually as if he were sitting on a bench. "This will be safe from the anaconda," he was saying. "If she tried to climb this high, the branches would break underneath her." Jessica nodded. She knew that she should be grateful, but right now, so far above the ground in a world that felt entirely alien, her ribs still sore from the anaconda's attack earlier, she was simply overwhelmed. She tried to hide the tears from Marcus, but was unable to stop their flow. She wondered if, when he shifted, he could smell the salt from her tears as easily as he could smell cook fires or tilled ground. Shh. I'm sorry about what happened before, but I swear I am not going to let anything happen to you." With her eyes still clamped shut, she could feel his hand reach for hers, holding it tightly. He was as casual as a trapeze walker on the thin branches, as careless as a man strolling down the street. She clung to his hand, and she wondered if what she felt was the warmth and strength of his vitality flowing into her. "We'll be fine, I promise, my beautiful Jessica." He murmured, and he kept talking to her, his words soft and soothing. Sooner than Jessica would have believed possible, a deep fatigue came over her, and the darkness of sleep started to edge her vision. Marcus was still there, still talking to her, soothing her, his voice deep and warm. "Please don't leave me," she whispered, and she felt more than heard him chuckle. "I never could," he murmured, brushing a hand across her cheek, and she had just enough time to wonder what he meant before sleep closed her eyes. Chapter 8. I have something to show you, Marcus said the next day. Jessica was back on solid ground again, and for all the travails of the day before, and the hunger that was gnawing viciously at her belly, felt oddly fit and ready. "All right," she said, and she wondered what he could possibly have been reluctant to divulge about after revealing that he was a werepanther. He stood in front of her, and he made a strange motion reaching up over one shoulder to tug at something that wasn't there. He wasn't even wearing his pack yet, and for a moment Jessica wondered what she was meant to see. Then his arm came down and somehow his hand wasn't empty. Jessica was aware that she was gaping like a fool, but there was nowhere the jeweled sword in his hand could have been. Nowhere it could have been hidden that she would not have seen. It was a gorgeous blade. The morning sun twinkled off its length, and even from where she stood, she could see that it was wickedly sharp. The crossguard was made of cold, sullen iron, but there were golden gems expertly set there. They made her think of cat's eyes glinting in the dark. The hilt was wrapped tight in black leather, and it looked as if it had been made to fit Marcus's large hand. "What is that?" she whispered, and Marcus smiled at her grimly. "A weapon," he said, "and perhaps the finest of its dwindling kind. You never saw it because I didn't want you to, and that's just one of the powers that it possesses. There are others, perhaps many others. I don't know all of them. Frankly, I'm not sure I want to know them." Jessica tore her eyes from the blade, wondering for a moment if there was something supernaturally compelling about it. Once he had drawn it, she had wanted, almost needed to look at it. And suddenly Jessica could imagine standing, eyes wide, as that gleaming length swept down on her. "Why do you have it?" He hesitated, and then he shrugged. "Because it is an ancient shifter weapon that cannot fall into the wrong hands," he said. "It'll be invisible for me when I want it to be, which allows me to continue on my mission of transporting it across Tanzania to a sanctuary where it can be properly protected." "That's why you didn't want any company on this trip," she said, and Marcus surprised her with a smile. "I would have changed my mind if I had known you," he promised. He sheathed the sword on his back again, and to her fascination, it disappeared. She couldn't see any weight rumpling his clothes or altering his stride. It wasn't just invisible, it was as if it was gone. She reached for the place where it should have been, but Marcus grabbed her hand, stopping her. He soothed the suddenness of his motion with a kiss to her palm, shaking his head. "Better not. I don't understand the damn thing. No one really does. It's better that we get it to a place where it can do the least harm and the most good." She nodded, and as she fell into step behind Marcus again, she wondered at how dark and mysterious the world was revealing itself to be, how very much was out there that could never be explained. Around midday, Jessica realized that they were in a dry gully, the stone on either side of them high and carved from the torrential waters of the centuries. It was beautiful, the red stone gorgeous in the clear air, but Jessica was too tired to absorb it. "We need to keep marching, but this gully is good," Marcus said. "Clear path, no underbrush to fight through, and I can't scent any enemies at all. You keep marching along it. I'm going to go scout the forest for a while to see if there's anything to be seen yet." Jessica, who had been dying for a break, took a deep breath and nodded. Her entire body felt as if it had been beaten with a baseball bat, and though some of it was the anaconda attack from the day before, she knew a great deal of it was simply exhaustion. Marcus seemed to sense her weariness, because he paused and pulled her into his arms. "This isn't forever," he murmured, kissing her on the forehead. I promise. Soon enough, you'll be in a place with soft beds and plenty of food where you can rest for a while. All right? All right, she said, and she smiled up at him. It wasn't a pretense she was putting up for him, she realized. She believed him. When he spoke, his voice rang with simple truth, and something in Jessica knew, beyond a doubt, that she could trust this man. Marcus smiled at her briefly, and he shed his clothes, stuffing them into her pack. She would have thought that she was too tired by far to be at all interested in a naked man, no matter how drop-dead gorgeous. But her breath still caught at the broadness of his chest and the elegant curve of his hip bones. Marcus tilted his head to shoot her a smile that was utterly rife with male satisfaction, and then he transformed into a black panther again. This time, instead of bounding off, he came closer to her, butting his head against her hand like a house cat seeking caresses. Despite the dire nature of their situation and her own exhaustion, Jessica couldn't help but laugh as she scratched her lover behind his dark, velvety ears. "Oh, so beautiful," she murmured, and Marcus rumbled in smug agreement. Then he was gone, leaping up the wall of the gully, his paws finding purchase on what looked like utterly flat stone. He paused at the top to look down at her before disappearing into the brush. Jessica looked after him for a moment, but then she shook her head. "All right, time to keep walking. Just 1 foot in front of the other. 1 step closer to the village. 1 step closer." Jessica lost all track of time. At some point in the last few hours, she had pulled back from her body, and she felt as if she were piloting it from a great distance. "I'll make it," she thought with detachment, feeling the ache in her legs and chest, the hunger that made it hard to think. "I'll make it." Her mantra, 1 foot in front of the other, dulled to a monotonous chant in her head, droning over and over. The anaconda from the night before could have appeared in the wash in front of her, and Jessica would have walked straight into the thing. Her steps were slower, but they were still steady, and she did her best to walk as steadily as she could, just 1 foot in front of the other. She wasn't sure when she started to smell roasting meat, but her head shot up and her mouth started to water. She was so hungry that a wave of dizziness washed over her, and then before she could think of being cautious, she was around the bend in the gully. The sight that met her eyes made her want to cry with relief. The gully had opened into a small, flat area, surrounded and protected by deep walls. At one end was an achingly clear pool, and at the other end, Marcus had set up a small camp. There was a fire crackling away with meat spitted neatly over it, and the man himself was tending the fire. He was still naked, but from the water that weighed down his hair, he had just come from the pool. "Oh, good, there you are," he said with a smile. "Another moment, and I would have started back looking for you." Jessica was so tired and so hungry that she couldn't speak. Marcus seemed to sense that, and he guided her to the smooth log near the fire, where he handed her one of the skewers of roasting meat. Jessica knew that in another time and place, she would have pulled away from it. It was dripping with grease and charred along one edge. It was so hot that she burned her tongue on it. There was a gamey taste that was like nothing she had ever tried before. However, right there and then, it was delicious, and to her surprise, it was all for her. "I ate my fill earlier," Marcus said when she had the wit to ask him about it. "The panther makes more out of the food I eat than my human body does. This is all for you, but take your time with it. You don't want to make yourself sick." She took his advice and slowed down, taking small sips of water from the canteen to chase every few bites. She had only been in the bush for a few days, but she was still astonished by how immediate and loud her body had become. Her responsibility on the trail was to tend to its needs as soon as she could, because otherwise she would not be able to do anything else. She couldn't finish all the meat that Marcus had hunted for her, and he bundled it up into small packets of leaves and twine. The heat of midday had come upon them, and when Marcus said they should rest for a few more hours, Jessica decided that she needed to be in the water. She started to pull off her clothes, but the meal had restored some of her natural modesty, because she hesitated. "What's the matter?" asked Marcus with a grin. He had put on his old jeans again, but otherwise he was still naked. "Feeling a little shy?" She lifted her chin up at the implied challenge in his voice, and defiantly she stood up and stripped her clothes off. She walked to the pool, aware that his hot gaze was still on her, and then she forgot all about it in the merciful coolness of the water. It was cold, clear, and she sighed as what felt like a year's worth of grime sluiced off her. Sooner than she would have thought, however, the cold got to her, and shivering, she returned to the fire. Marcus had laid out a blanket of leaves for them, and she came to lie down next to him. There was precious little padding between them and the ground, but clean and with a belly full of meat, she hardly cared. As she was drifting off, however, a thought occurred to her. "I don't think I've ever tasted meat like that before," Jessica said thoughtfully, and Marcus chuckled. "No, you wouldn't have," he said, and something about his tone made her sit up and take notice. "I've tried a lot of different meat," she said, leaning up on her elbow. "I mean, I've worked in Tanzania and Nairobi." "Have you worked in South America?" he asked reasonably, and she froze. South America?" "Where anacondas come from." Marcus was clearly suppressing a grin, and Jessica's head started to spin. "Oh God, did he chase that snake woman down? Did he butcher her? Am I eating? She gagged, staggering up and away from Marcus, but before she could even get off the blanket, he had risen and caught her in his arms. "Oh God, that's disgusting!" she cried out wildly. "What the? No, oh my God!" Calm down, Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her. Panicked, she fought him, raining blows on his arms even as she was aware that it was nothing to him. "Don't tell me to calm down!" she yelled. "Why didn't you tell me? Why the hell didn't you?" "It's wild pig," Marcus said between laughs. "I swear, it's just wild pig." She stilled, looking up at him with wide eyes. "Wild pig?" "Yeah, there's a stream not far from here. It stopped to drink. I killed it and ate my fill. I tore off a few chunks of meat to drag back here and cook for you. It's wild pig. It's definitely not anaconda." She searched his face for truth, and when she found it there, she could feel the panic and disgust drain out of her brain. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I swear to you, I wouldn't have fed you snake, let alone a person. Well, not without telling you." She was silent, and tentatively he released her. The humor had drained out of his face now, and he was looking a little worried. "Jessica, say something. Are you all right?" "I was just making a joke. I didn't think it would get to you so much. I'm sorry. I should have thought." He reached a tentative hand to brush her hair back, and stepping forward into his space, Jessica gave him a hard shove. The look of surprise on Marcus's face was almost enough to make up for her panic, and she started to laugh. "Oh my God, you're an ass!" she shouted, wailing on him and beating her fists against his chest. "You are such an asshole! You made me think I was eating a person!" After a moment of shock, Marcus joined in her laughter. He suffered her blows for a moment, and then as easily as someone grabbing hold of a kitten, he caught both of her wrists in one large hand. "I can't help it. You make it too easy," he protested with a grin. "If you were in my place..." "I wouldn't be an ass and tell someone they were eating a person," she retorted. "Even if that person was some nasty skank who had tried to kill you." She tried to attack him again, but with a soft grunt he took her to the ground, pinning her with her hands over her head. Jessica realized that she was entirely naked underneath a man who was also almost naked, stretched out, completely vulnerable and open. "No, you don't have a cruel bone in your body, do you?" he said softly, and his eyes roved her form up and down. Jessica licked her lips. "I try not to be cruel," she said, her voice soft. "I mean, I can be snide and petty sometimes, I guess. But I never want to be cruel. I want to help. I want to serve." "And that makes you so special," he whispered. He leaned down to kiss her. There was plenty of time for Jessica to turn her head, to shrug him off. She knew that if she did so, he would let her up. It would have been wiser to do so. She was here in Tanzania on an important mission. She couldn't let herself be distracted by a man, by romance. Jessica tilted her head up to kiss him, and when their lips met, she felt that same electric thrill run through her. There was something in her that was drawn to this man, and she whimpered as her body reached for him. The heat pooled in her lower belly, and when he tenderly ran a rough hand from her throat, down her sternum to her thighs, she arched against him. We should get back on the trail," she whispered, and he shook his head. "Too hot. If we walk in midday, we'll be slow. The whole forest is slowed down for the heat. We can spare an hour or two." "An hour or two," Jessica murmured, trying to sound casual. The effect was rather ruined by the gasp as Marcus tweaked her erect nipple gently. "What, will we do for an hour or two?" "Oh, I'm sure we'll think of something," Marcus said. He might have wanted to sound casual, but there was a tremor to his voice and a darkness in his eyes that told her how very much he wanted her. He was crouched half over her like a panther devouring its prey, and through the thin fabric of his jeans, she could feel his arousal clearly. Deliberately, she pressed her thigh up against his erection, and he groaned. "You are a dangerous thing," he said, and she might have responded, but then he slid a hand between her legs. She gasped a little at the intimacy of it, but when he started to trace her soft and vulnerable cleft there, she whimpered instead, opening her legs a little farther to allow him more access. She wanted to reach for him, but he still held her hands over her head. Jessica felt pinioned, like prey he had hunted and was now enjoying as much as he liked. There was something delicious about that thought, and something deep inside her relaxed. He was going to do what he liked to her. All she could do was enjoy the pleasure. It was as if Marcus could sense her surrender. His free hand roved her body, squeezing and petting her by turns, as his mouth swooped down over hers. The kiss he gave her was claiming, dominant and wild. He let her hands go, but before she could reach for him, he reached for his belt. He looped the belt around her arms twice before tugging it tight, and now she was tied even more securely. "This is mine," he growled, running his hands down her body. "I'm going to enjoy you." She should have protested, but instead, the word that rose to her lips was a whispered yes, so full of longing that it made both of them shiver. She lay on the blanket in the shade of the gully, her eyes open but unseeing as he started to touch her. All she could do was shiver as he stroked her, kissing her body and nuzzling it. There was something primal about the way he touched her, less like a man touching her for pleasure, more like a wild animal exploring her, feeling her and learning about her responses and her needs. Thinking was not something that Jessica could handle right now. Her body was set on fire with his touch, and all she could do was respond to him. So beautiful. He nearly groaned as if he could not bear it. You're what I have wanted for so long. He leaned down to kiss her with a kind of reverence that made her shiver. There was nothing playful in his touch now, nothing casual. Instead, it felt as if they were enacting some sacred ritual, some age-old dance that their kind had danced for millennium. I want you, she murmured, and Jessica knew that she had never spoken more sincere words. He swore briefly at her words, standing up to strip off his jeans, all that was left of his clothing. When she could see him in the light of day, she caught her breath. Jessica was certain that she had never seen a man that was more perfect, never seen someone who was more profoundly good-looking. This was not a body that was a product of a gym or pointless repeated movement. Marcus was a weapon, one honed for use and intent on survival. It plucked a chord deep inside her, and she knew that she would never respond to any other quite this way again. Naked now with nothing between them, Marcus came to cover her body with his. She could feel his clean skin slide over hers, and as he dropped fervent kisses over her upturned face, her vulnerable throat, and her breasts, she could also feel his erect member pressed hard against her thigh. Instinctively, she knew that he was ready to take her, but at the same time, he wouldn't, not yet. He thrust his hand between her legs, his clever fingers gliding over her slit, circling, making her gasp. In less time than she would believe, Jessica was bucking up against him, mewling frantically, as she tried to gain her satisfaction from his fingers. Maddeningly, he would rub her soft flesh for several minutes with a steady pressure that made her whimper. But just as she thought she would reach her climax, he pulled back, leaving her shaking and longing. "Please," she finally cried. "Marcus, please. I don't know how much longer I can wait." For a moment, she wondered if Marcus would be so cruel as to deny her. But then with a muffled growl, he grabbed her by the hips and turned her over, pulling her up so that she was kneeling on the blanket, her belted wrists and elbows flat against the ground. In the heat of her mind, Jessica realized that in this position, presenting herself to the man that she wanted more than she wanted anything else, they were mating like animals in the jungle, a primal and wild dance that was older than cities, older than humans even. "I'm going to take you," Marcus growled, and she felt her belly turn to liquid at the force in his voice. "I'm going to ride you, and Jessica, I'm going to make you feel so good." She stuttered out an answer, or at least she tried to. All thought of words vacated her mind, however, when he rose over her, taking her hips in his hands. For just a single moment, she could feel his cock press up against her warm entrance, the blunt head sliding against her slick flesh. Then he pressed deep into her, touching the very core of her being with one single thrust. "Oh, Marcus!" She cried out, unable to help herself, and his response was a growled sound that might have been her name. For a moment, they simply froze like that, perfect and joined deeply. Then he started to move, setting a pace that was nearly punishing, and she cried out frantically. The heat and pleasure that swirled inside her found form now, gathering low in her belly and swelling up higher and higher, hotter and hotter. The pleasure he was giving her was so intense that she could barely think of a climax. But then the edge of it was there, heating up deep inside her and making her cry out with a deep need. She thought that the tension might last forever, but then he thrust one hand beneath her body, finding her clit with an unerring accuracy. Jessica wailed at the first touch, and then she was trapped between his hard thrusts and the sure strokes of his fingers. The two sensations met and melded together into something that was nearly white-hot. She could not have controlled herself if she wanted to. Instead, she closed her eyes tight, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't want to tip over the edge until he did, until he had fallen over that imperceptible edge as well. But the motion of his body and the skill of his fingers was making that difficult. She tried to pull back, but she might as well have tried to stand against an avalanche. Jessica could feel her body stretch out as if it were a thread, pulled harder and tighter, and then suddenly it was too much. The pleasure rolled over her, and her ability to resist was gone. She snapped, and the pleasure rushed in, filling her from head to toe, as she groaned with need and fulfilled lust. She knew that she was calling Marcus's name, and more distantly she could hear his own voice, calling hers in return. With one final thrust, his liquid heat spilled deep within her, claiming her just as his bite had. Somehow his pleasure meshed with her own, twining around it and making it all the more powerful. For a moment, it was even as if she was feeling what he could feel. Every muscle tensed as he spilled inside her. It was as if the entire world had lit up with sunlight before going dim again. And by the time Jessica's body dropped down to the blanket of leaves, limp and spent, she was shaking with exhaustion. She whimpered a little when Marcus pulled away from her, but then she purred with pleasure as he kissed the damp skin at the base of her neck. There was something about being in his arms that could make her forget all about the mess they were in and the danger in the forest around them. Jessica was almost drifting off when she heard Marcus heave a sigh. He sat up, only chuckling a little at her murmur of discontent. "Come on, sweetheart. Time to get up. We have plenty of daylight yet. Lots of miles to put behind us." She groaned, but obediently she staggered to her feet. All right, she grumbled, but she stopped when Marcus swept her hand up into his, kissing the knuckles with a kind of old-world charm. "Soon," he whispered. "Maybe we won't be so rushed." Even as she blushed, she could feel her body tightening in anticipation of his words, and she grinned, reaching for her pack. There were, she thought, worse ways to motivate her. That night, after Jessica had faded off into a deep sleep in her hammock, Marcus stayed up. He would return to his feline form soon, but right now there was something too precious, too real about simply watching her sleep. The moon had risen, casting everything into deep black shadows and silver light. Under the moon, Jessica looked oddly fragile, even though he knew at this point she was tougher than she had any reason to be. If he had foreseen these circumstances back when he first met her, Marcus knew that he would have dismissed her out of hand. She was too small, too weak, simply too human to survive the trek, let alone thrive. Now he knew different, and from his branch close to her sleeping hammock, he reached out to brush her hair out of her face. In her sleep she smiled a little, shifting towards his touch and making the hammock sway slightly. Marcus's heart tightened at the look of her, and with a feeling of dread, he knew that it was time to acknowledge how he felt to her. Marcus was a man who enjoyed women. It was a simple fact, and until now, no more troublesome than an affection for beer or a certain type of meal. This was the first time in his long life that he had looked at a woman and known beyond a shadow of a doubt that the word enjoy was far too pallid a word for her, too weak and pale by far. The wild, protective, and tumultuous feelings that coursed through him could not be corralled by a simple desire for her beautiful body. No, it was a longing for the woman herself, a need to possess her that would drive him insane. He had not been looking for a mate when he started this journey. Now that Marcus had found her, he didn't know what to do. "I love you," he whispered to her sleeping form, and though she didn't stir at that, there was something in him that was at peace just for saying it aloud. Now he simply had to get her back to civilization with a pack of enemies on their trail. Simple. Chapter 9. Jessica looked up with surprise when she heard running water. "There's a river ahead?" she asked, and Marcus smiled at her. "A river has fish in it, and in most cases, a river provides us with a clear-cut way towards a village. It does me no good to smell civilization if I can't cross a gorge to get to it." In less than an hour they had reached a wide river that was racing along swiftly. Jessica couldn't resist running her hands in the cold, fresh water, splashing her face briskly. The water from the still pool in the gully felt like a beloved memory more than something that had happened the day before, and the water on her skin was like a blessing of some kind. Jessica watched in bemusement as Marcus stalked out to the shallows, his trouser legs rolled up fastidiously. He didn't look like he felt the cold of the water at all. He peered into the surface of the water, facing upstream, and just as she was getting ready to ask him what he was doing, his hand shot into the roiling water, faster than she could see. In a moment, there was a flopping wild fish in his hands, alive and desperate to escape. To Jessica's surprise, Marcus brought the fish to his lips. For a moment, it looked as if he was whispering something to it, and then with a flash, it was out of his grasp and back in the water. Marcus nodded with satisfaction and made his way back to shore. "Did you and the fish have a good conversation?" she hazarded, and Marcus grinned at her. "Fish don't converse, Jessica. Get real," he said, and she smacked his shoulder with the back of her hand gently. "How would I know? It seems like you talk to everyone else." Marcus chuckled at her words. "Fair enough. I suppose it's been a strange new world that I've dropped you into, hasn't it? That fish? Let's call it a long shot. There's a chance that it can transport a message for me. Get us some help. Tell someone where we are, or at least let them know where we've been." "So that means that there's also a chance of something else happening." He grinned at her with real humor, and she wondered again at his spirit and his heart that could keep them going when she was all but ready to stop and to collapse from sheer weariness. "There's also a chance I did nothing beyond confuse a very nervous and now traumatized fish," he said gravely. For some reason, that made Jessica laugh, and once she started, she couldn't stop. She sat down on the ground, covering her face and shaking her head. Marcus waited patiently for her sobs of laughter to subside. But when they showed no sign of doing so, he simply sat down next to her. Eventually, the hilarity left her, and Jessica shook her head, looking at him with a fond smile. "Whatever life with you is like, Marcus," she said, "it is definitely not dull." Jessica would never have said that life in the jungle, trying to walk away from a plane crash, was dull. And it wasn't, but over the next few days, she found it surprisingly peaceful. Despite her fears and Marcus's, his enemies made no appearance again, and even if she twitched whenever the underbrush shook, there were no wild snake women to emerge and try to kill her again. Their days settled into a pattern, long walks interspersed with breaks, and at night, Marcus would string her up in the trees to sleep. "Like a ham you want to keep away from the bears," she said a little ruefully. "You are at least as valuable to me as a Virginia ham," he responded gravely, although there is one big difference. She eyed him through the dim twilight. Once she was safe, he would descend and hunt. In the morning, by the time she woke up, there was often food cooking, and though she found that she was hungry more often than she might have wished, she was not starving. One big difference between me and a large chunk of roasted salted pork? This I have to hear. The look he shot her was sharp with more teeth than she thought she had seen. There was something hungry about it that shook her a little, but instead of repelling her, it drew her in. She would have called it animal magnetism if she didn't want to be too pat, but there it was. Well, if you were a ham, I would have been nibbling you along every stop this trip. Well, I think you know all you need to about eating me, she muttered with a hot blush. The words brought to mind pictures of his skilled mouth venturing low on her body, teasing out sensations that she had never thought she was capable of. Right now, once again, Jessica could tell that that was exactly what was on Marcus's mind. If they were on the ground, there was no telling what they might be doing together right now. Jessica was growing to trust the hammock to carry her weight, but she didn't think that she would trust it to handle her weight and Marcus's at the same time, let alone if they'd tried something more energetic than just sleeping. Marcus laughed as if he could read her mind, and then, in a dizzying display of athleticism, he hopped onto a nearby branch to lean in and give her a kiss. It didn't matter that she was dozens of feet up in the air, or that there was really nothing between her and the hard ground. The kiss warmed her, and when he pulled away, she only sighed with regret. "Be good," he said with a wink. "I'm off to hunt. Possibly I'll bring you wild fowl of some kind for breakfast." Then he was gone, and no matter how hard Jessica listened, she could never hear more than the softest thump of his panther's body hitting the ground. The rattling pack of testing and sampling equipment reminded her of the dire nature of her mission. But otherwise, there was something almost idyllic about their trek. She missed the comforts of her life before less than she thought she had, and there was a tiny part of her that suggested that perhaps she would not mind doing this forever. Jessica pushed that thought down whenever it came up. It was ridiculous. She wasn't in Africa to get a boyfriend, damn it. She was here to save lives, and a distraction like Marcus certainly didn't have a place in her world. Not really. When she looked ahead to a time when she would have to split her path from his, it made something in her heart tear. But she ignored it. She was a woman with a mission, and from what he had told her about his sword, he had a mission of his own. Our paths are the same for the moment. We should walk together as long as we can, and then it will be over. That morning she was not thinking of missions or anything more important than navigating the steep path in front of them without falling and breaking an ankle. Jessica was trying to find the best way to descend the slope, Marcus below and watching her intently, when she heard a soft buzzing roar. "What the hell?" she murmured, but there was more exasperation than fear in her voice. The swarm of mosquitoes seemed to rise up around her like smoke, sudden and thick, and she clamped her mouth shut to avoid swallowing any. "What's the matter?" Marcus asked, suddenly concerned, and she waved at him to tell him she would be right down. She wasn't overly worried. She was inoculated against the worst of what mosquitoes had to offer, and mosquitoes were typically sluggish during the day, uninterested in even the most easygoing of hosts. She concentrated on climbing down towards Marcus, who seemed to be getting more agitated by the moment. It was true that these mosquitoes were more aggressive than she was used to. They seemed intent on following her, on trying to alight on her limbs. Of course, they were still incredibly light and fragile insects, and a single swipe of her arm knocked a good half-dozen spinning away. She knew that she had not gotten off scot-free. She had suffered at least a small handful of bites, but that was a small price to pay for getting through the jungle of Tanzania, she figured. "All right, I'm ready to go," she said once she had made it to level ground again. "Did you get bitten at all?" Marcus was still looking up the path where the pests had come from, and he shook his head. Not at all. Lucky, she said with a grimace. I guess you're one of those people who don't really draw mosquitoes. That's not it, he said. She might have questioned Marcus more, but then they were back on the trail. He had told her that they were getting close to some of the human habitations he could smell. Their scents were present all the time rather than just when the wind was right. And though she knew that rushing would be worse than dawdling, Jessica couldn't stop herself from walking just a little faster, hoping to get to a place where she could discharge her mission, offer the help that she had. Hey, wait, you're walking really fast, Marcus said, and Jessica glanced back at him with humor. Oh, are you wearing out a little? She teased. That'll be the day when a little human female can best me, he retorted, quickening his pace to match hers. If Jessica had been paying attention, she might have noticed that there was a flash of concern that went through his eyes, but she was too intent on the path ahead. When twilight began to close in, Jessica groaned in frustration. God, we're never going to get anywhere, she said, gazing into the deepening shadows with irritation. I don't suppose you've got eyes that can see into the dark and that you can just, I don't know, keep leading us? Can you? Marcus shot her a look that was distinctly unamused. I can, but I won't. If I led you into that, you'd probably fall and twist your ankle after only a dozen steps. Just because I can see a clear path doesn't mean that you can. Jessica felt as if she might cry with frustration as she set her pack down. I hate this, she whispered. She felt as if her entire body was covered with sweat and grime. She would have paid an easy 10 grand if she could just push her way out of her skin. I can't stand this. I'll be honest, I'm not too fond of it myself, Marcus said grimly. To her surprise, he came to sit next to her, taking her hand in his. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and then she shocked herself with a sudden and intense anger at the thought. If he tries to kiss me, I'm going to slug him, she thought grimly, and then she was shocked at herself. Even when the trail was at its worst, she had not gotten angry at Marcus's touch. There was bright and shiny aggressive layer of glass between herself and the rest of the world, and right now she was realizing how very foreign it was. Marcus nodded as if he could hear her thoughts. Your pulse is up, and your skin is burning. You look a bit as if you want to bite my head off. I wouldn't, she protested, but he shook his head. If it would make you feel better, I would let you bite the hell out of me, he said. As it is, I'm worried. I think those mosquitoes gave you something nasty. I know about every disease that incubates between here and South Africa, she protested, and I've been inoculated against. You don't, Marcus said, and she was feeling far too worked up to hear the worry and the raw fear in his voice. Jessica, I need you to sit down and to take several deep breaths. When had she gotten to her feet? Jessica knew that he was right about the pulse, because right now, she felt as if she had run a marathon. Her body was drenched with exhaustion, but there was a nervous energy that vibrated through it, making her shiver with a need to be away from here, to be moving, to be acting. Let's keep walking, she said, almost begged. I want to keep walking. I mean, the sooner we find people, the sooner I can rest, right? I want to keep going. She didn't wait to hear Marcus's response. Instead, she spun away from him, intent on starting down that trail with or without him. She did not think of the dangers of the night or the uneven terrain. All she knew was that if she didn't keep moving, she might die. Marcus's hand around her wrist felt like an iron manacle, and she cried out at how cold his grasp was. It nearly hurt, but even as she tugged, he refused to let her go. Her exhausted mind crossed over from panic into rage, and she spun towards him. There was a torrent of poison on her mouth that she was ready to unleash on him, but then her vision swam as if she was underwater. It felt like the ground was falling away, and somehow her feet had stayed with it as her head was catapulted towards the clouds. She was moving fast, her stomach rolling with unease as she went, and all that was stable in the world was Marcus, watching her, his face pale and worried. You might be right." Jessica got out, and then she collapsed. Chapter 10. When he thought back to that night much later, Marcus would remember it as being one of the longest nights of his life. In the lavender light of evening, he watched in shock as Jessica collapsed in on herself like a house of cards, as if every bone in her body had disconnected from its neighbor. He caught her before she hit the ground. In his arms, she felt light and impossibly hot, as if all the essence that made her who she was had evaporated straight out of her slight body. Her bright, clear eyes opened wide for a moment, and he saw her shape his name. And he saw her shape his name with her lips. Then her eyes rolled back in her head, and he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was no natural illness. He thought of the people chasing him, and for a moment, Marcus wanted nothing more than to find and slaughter every single one of them. He was a warrior by nature, and his instincts rode high and hot for a moment. Then common sense reasserted itself, and he knew that he had to take care of Jessica. He gathered her in his arms, and with the sure step and certain vision of his animal nature, he walked into the forest. Less than half an hour later, he had found what he needed, a small cave rising out of the forest floor. The opening was barely taller than his shoulder, the inside of the cave not much higher, but it was deep enough, and what he had prayed for. The debris told him that other animals had used it as home, but they were gone now. Marcus couldn't leave her in a hammock in this state. He would need to stay with her, and that meant going to ground. He made her a bed of fallen branches covered with a blanket of fronds, and then wove her a bower out of tall sticks and mosquito netting. When he was done, Marcus tried not to focus on how much she looked like Sleeping Beauty behind the swaths of gauze, beautiful and perfectly still. Marcus went to the cave mouth and took a deep breath. He had wanted to avoid this if at all possible. They weren't his people. They weren't his enemies. But in the distant past, their people and his had quarreled. And while there was no bad blood, there was no strong affection either. It didn't matter. He would have to take the risk. He lifted his head up to the sky, which was now a deep and velvet blue. He could have made this call in his panther shape. From his human mouth it came out harsher, less nuanced, but no less desperate, no less demanding. For a long moment he heard the echoes of his scream recede and then disappear. Nothing happened, but he wondered what he could have expected. Marcus dragged large branches across the front of the cave and created a banked fire to act as a barrier. It would keep them warm, it would ward off most natural enemies, and it would allow him to see the woman he loved. At that moment, risk or not, he wasn't sure that he would be able to take his eyes off her. He joined her under the netting, and almost instinctively she reached for him. Her eyes were closed, but she stirred fitfully. There was a strange scent rising from her, almost sticky sweet, and it gave him more evidence that this was no natural ailment. There were demons yammering at the back of his mind, telling him what might happen to her if he could not get her help, if he could not save her, but he savagely shut them up. She had soaked the clothes that she was wearing with sweat, and after a moment of indecision, he stripped them from her body. There was a mostly clean cloth in his bag, and after soaking it in water from the canteen, he started to bathe her. The water was only lukewarm, but she still cried out piteously at the shock to her skin, and Marcus bit his lip as he held her still. He could feel his male body responding to her nudity, and while he would never touch her while she was not awake to consent to it, he was forced to acknowledge the hold she had over him. There was a bond between them that was made of more than just their circumstances. He would have felt like this if they had met in the largest city in the world, at the top of the mountain, or the bottom of the sea. Somehow his heart had left his body and entered that of the pale and trembling woman in his arms. "I love you," he murmured, bathing her fevered limbs over and over again. "I love you, Jessica. Don't leave me." She wept thin tears in her delirium, shuddering and whispering his name. He knew that she was unconscious, but whenever she said his name, he felt a moment of tortured pleasure mingled with satisfaction. It seemed to take hours, but finally she was still, sleeping a restless but finally quiet sleep. Marcus settled down next to her, watching the fire as it burned, looking out to the shadows beyond. "Please," he prayed, but at this moment he wasn't sure who was listening. At some point, Marcus had fallen asleep. He was awakened from violent dreams by a scream, and he rose up from the bed, ready to transform, ready to fight. He realized two things. First, that it was morning, the banked fire completely dead. Second, his call had been received. A second shriek followed the first, and even if he had not at least partially understood their tongue, he would have recognized it as a challenge. Come out and prove that you are who you say you are. He glanced back at Jessica, still on the bed he had made. She slept quietly, but she looked pale and drawn, as if she had lost weight in the night. He took a deep breath and walked out into the thin dawn light. They weren't making a point to hide themselves. Instead, they sat in the trees around him, their dark forms hanging from the branches. The chimpanzee troop watched him with cold, round eyes, and in a moment Marcus could see that this was a warband that had come to meet him. All adult males in their prime, a single one could tear a man's arm from his body. There was nothing in the jungle that would take on the full brunt of a warring troop, and now they all watched him to see what he would do next. Marcus spread out his hands to show them that he meant no harm, and when that at least did not provoke an attack, he started to speak. "I am Marcus Vanderberg, and I'm on a mission. My plane was downed miles ago, and my human companion has been attacked. It is some dark magic that has taken her, nothing that I can cure with human medicines. She is suffering." He hesitated for a moment, and even if the words choked him, he knew that they had to be said. "She may be dying. Please, I know that I am in your territory. I swear we are only passing through. I ask for your help now. If you help us, I will owe you a forfeit. Anything. My teeth, my claws. Please, help us. Help her." There was a moment of utter stillness in the jungle. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The largest male, enormous even for his kind, seemed to come to a decision. He shrieked a response in their dialect, and two smaller males dropped down from the trees. They approached Marcus, and Marcus thought that it was the hardest thing he had ever done to let them skirt around him and to take Jessica. He knew that he could have killed two easily, perhaps even three, but a troop of this size would overwhelm him unless he fled, and he could not flee, not when Jessica would be left behind. He was grateful to see that they handled Jessica with care, their large and clever hands gentle on her prone form. She stirred, but she couldn't even call his name anymore. Marcus told himself that they might still be too late, but he brushed it aside. The chimpanzees followed their leader into the forest, and with a sigh, Marcus followed them into the depths. Chapter 11. The sound wasn't singing. That much Jessica was certain of. It was perhaps more like humming, with a soft cadence that made her think of words. It was what singing was at the dawn of time, when such things were still an experimentation on the part of people, stepping out of the cloak of the prehistoric. Then she realized that she was not burning up any longer, that she was resting on what felt like an actual bed. For a moment, Jessica simply lay still in awe. Somehow she had never thought she would lie in a bed again. "Ah, you are awake." The voice was soft and sweet, but for some reason there was something foreign about it that confused her. Jessica had dealt with languages all over the world, but there was something about this one that puzzled her even as she turned around. There was a figure silhouetted in the bright daylight coming through the door, and Jessica smiled tentatively. Then she saw the woman in the doorway, and her eyes widened. The woman wore a plain woven cloth as a short kilt around her narrow hips, but otherwise, from the soles of her long mobile feet to her small long breasts and the top of her head, she was bare. Her pale skin shone through the long coarse fur that covered her from head to foot, and the hair on her round head was no longer than that on her body. Her ears were round and pierced with a dozen golden rings, and her face was flat across the eyes and the nose and came out to a rounded muzzle in the front. That's why it sounded foreign, she realized belatedly. She's speaking English without a human throat. "Hello?" Jessica managed to croak, and the woman tisked, handing her a small pot full of clean water. It tasted so good that Jessica drained it in a moment. The woman did not laugh, but her eyes crinkled with humor, and she patted Jessica with a large hand over her shoulder. Jessica observed that her hand was mostly naked of fur, and even from that soft touch she could feel how strong the woman was. "Excuse me, but I don't know where I am or how I came here." Her eyes widened. "Please, there's a man with me, Marcus." The woman nodded, covering Jessica's hands with hers to keep her still. "It is all fine, I promise. The were-panther summoned us, and we came. We treated your illness and put you to sleep, letting you heal on your own. That is best for such things." "My illness?" A faint flicker of unease passed in front of the woman's eyes. "It was a cruel thing that was done to you. Your man has some bad enemies, a thing you should understand." "He's not my... well..." There was really no way to say it, and so Jessica kept silent. The woman nodded as if she understood and offered Jessica a hand. "Would you like to come see the village?" Though she still felt about as shaky as a newborn fawn, Jessica was deeply curious, and once she stepped outside, she gasped. Africa was home to some of the most ancient trees of the old world, and she could see the truth of that now. She had been sleeping in an enormous treehouse, camped far above the forest floor. The tree limbs were easily as wide as sidewalks, and from where she stood she could see dozens of other tree houses, though she quickly decided that that was far too humble a word for the structures. They were elegant, and at a glance she could see that they were ancient as well. She felt as if she had happened upon a space that was out of time, inhabited by a people who were only distantly related to the humans she knew. She wondered where Marcus was, realizing that she missed him with a ferocity that seemed to tear at her soul. Almost as if in response to her thoughts, there was a sudden shrieking that sounded like a cross between the shouts of children and the cries of young chimps. Suddenly the air was full of youngsters, some in their beast shape, and some in the more human but somehow very alien shape that her caregiver wore. Jessica could barely stop to register the threat when there was a roar to her right, and suddenly an enormous black panther dropped down to the branch that she stood on. There was a moment of shock that drenched Jessica like a bucket of water, but there was no fear at all. She recognized this beast, for he was hers, and she smiled at him. "Scaring the children?" she asked, and with a purr, Marcus rose into his man form again. There was a cloth just inside the door that he used to wind around his hips, and he turned to her with a smile. "Putting them through their paces," he said. "Not sure they've ever been chased through the trees before." The woman made a snorting sound at him, shaking her head. "You underestimate us," she said. "The kingdom of trees has been protected by the best warriors of the world since the dawn of your own history. We simply believe in allowing children to be children while they are growing." "That's as it should be," Marcus said, and he turned to Jessica. "You look good," he said, and though his words were simple, even flippant, she could hear the relief and concern in his voice. "I feel good," she said, realizing it was true. "How did we get here?" "Through the goodwill of the people of the trees," he said, nodding at the woman who stood slightly apart from them. "I called, and they were generous enough to answer. Kayla here is the one who saved your life with her medicines, but it was their war chief who made the ruling to bring us in rather than leaving us to die in the forest." "Thank you," Jessica said to Kayla, who nodded with all the regal dignity of a queen. "I can't thank you enough." "Your man's people and mine have quarreled in the past," she said, "but I noticed your satchel. You are a healer, and those have always had a place among us." Jessica nodded. A part of her wanted nothing more than to stay in these beautiful houses high in the jungle canopy, to get to know the people who had saved her, but she knew that her time there was limited. "Then you understand why I need to be on my way," she said reluctantly. "I think I am well enough to go some distance, Marcus." "Not tonight," Marcus said immediately. "There's no reason to get started when there's so little day left." She glanced up at the sun in confusion. There were several hours of daylight left. They could make some significant distance in that amount of time. She opened her mouth to protest, but Kayla interjected. "He is right. You have only just woken up. Rest now. You can make better time with a decent night of sleep and some food in your belly." Jessica wanted to protest, but at last she had to defer to the wisdom of the healer and Marcus's strange insistence. She thought that there was something going on, but she couldn't imagine what that would be. Kayla offered to show her some of the healing house where she had been sleeping, and with Marcus pacing by her side, covered only in a swath of dyed cloth around his waist, she couldn't resist. The kingdom of trees was by turns archaic and modern. There was running water using pipes that were cast from ceramic, and there was a system of walkways from tree to tree that any civil engineer would have envied. However, there was no sign of a wheel, and when Jessica thought about it, she laughed in realization. What use did the people of the trees have for wheels when they spent their lives high above? Anything that needed carrying was slung over a shoulder and simply carried. The people were all extremely strong, and Jessica could see how they had built up their kingdom. Jessica was just getting a little weary when Kayla insisted that she return to her rooms for a bath. She conceded that Jessica did not need someone to watch her, something that disappointed Marcus a little, but that she should give up her clothes for washing. Instead, a wrap was left on a stool by her bath, and Jessica gratefully sank into a tub of cool water perfumed with something that smelled a great deal like tea tree oil. Her body felt as if it was unwinding from all of the stress that had been building up for the last few days. They had told her that she had been sick and close to death, but as thoroughly as Kayla had healed her, she could barely believe it. Still, there was something perfectly decadent about simply sitting in a tub of water that was meant only for bathing, allowing all of the stress and fear to drain from her. The pleasure of the bath was spoiled by the doubts that had been nagging at her. Marcus was hiding something, and that made it difficult to rest. With a sigh, long before she was ready to be done, she rose from the bath, scrubbing her body down with the woven towel that had been left, and returned to her room. She would go find Marcus, she decided, tucking the cloth around her body, and she would get the answers that she needed. Chapter 12. Jessica got instructions to Marcus's chamber from a half-grown girl with an enormous orange flower tucked behind her ear. She gestured the way to Marcus's chamber with a wrinkling of her eyes that Jessica could only assume was a giggle, and before Jessica could ask any more, she scampered away. She knocked on the door lightly, and when Marcus called for her to come in, she entered, shutting the door behind her. Marcus stood in front of the wide window of foggy glass, gazing out over the fading light. The sunset streaked the room with orange and red, salmon pink and indigo. He only wore the cloth slung low over his hips, and as he turned towards her, the flash of light reflected in his eyes reminded her that though he was her lover, he was far from human. Jessica had been practicing what she wanted to say ever since she left her room, but now faced with the reality of her lover, the vital presence of his body, his soul, the words were small and paltry. They died on her lips. Instead, he reached for her, and mutely she went to him. Jessica, there's a great deal to say, and even now I don't know how to say it, he said roughly. I want you. I need you. The currents of doubt almost made her step back, but the rawness of his tone called to her. Then take me, she said. Jessica reached up to cup her hand around the back of his neck, dragging him down for a deep kiss. He felt almost reluctant at first, but when he felt the edge of her tongue run over his lower lip, something broke his control. Suddenly his arms were around her, so tightly that she gasped. He eased up, but only so that he could drag her to the enormous bed. It was made up with pure white, amazingly crisp sheets, and for a moment, all Jessica could do was revel in how luxurious it was to make love in a bed, a real bed, after all this time. She sunk into the mattress with a sigh, and then he was rising over her, his mouth so hungry at her throat and her shoulders that a deep shiver went through her. Twice she felt his teeth at her shoulder, and twice he backed off. Jessica only knew that there was a deep need inside her that welled up for him and everything he was, and she laid her hand on his forearm. Do it, she whispered achingly. Mark me. Show the world that I'm yours. His groan was almost pained, and then he bit her, not hard enough to break skin, but close. She gasped at the sweet pain of it. She dug her nails into his arms, leaving marks of her own. The moment he let her go, she was flooded with an array of sensations that rolled through her like a river of firecrackers, her entire body tingling. Oh yes, I want you. I want you so. Marcus's growl vibrated through both their bodies, and for a moment she wondered if she saw that his eyes had slit pupils rather than round ones. Then he reached down to tear the cloth from both their bodies, as if anything that separated them burned. Skin to skin they embraced like the first lovers in the world, discovering, unable to get enough of each other. There was something desperate about his motions, something wild and needy. Jessica tried to calm him, but in a matter of moments she was carried away by their desire as well. She was not any more patient than he was, and she found herself clawing at him. Her nails raked down his back and his thighs, urging him to kiss her harder, to suck on her nipples and to dip his tongue into the sweet cup of her navel. I'll never get enough of you. He groaned, his face pressed against her hip. Not if I lived 100 years. Not if I lived 1,000. She could feel the thick weight of his manhood against her thigh. For a moment she thought he would take her right then, but instead he rolled over on his back. He was large, but uncommonly quick. His heavy hands came down on her hips, and with nothing more than that to warn her, he heaved her on top of his thighs, her legs trailing to either side of him. "Oh," Jessica said in surprise, looking down at her lover. Even if he was beneath her, however, Marcus had ceded none of his strength or his domination. Sitting on top of him, she felt as light as a toy, something that he liked to look at and to touch. He ran his hands down her body, cupping her breasts in his palms before squeezing enough to make her groan. Underneath her, she could feel his shaft hot against her most intimate flesh. She could feel the way he longed to enter her, but with his hands keeping her still, she could not move things forward. She was on top of him, but she was helpless, and she keened with need. "Oh God, please!" she cried out. "Please! Please!" Marcus didn't seem to hear her. His hands tight on her hips, he rolled his body up to meet hers. It felt like riding in a way, and she could feel her cheeks light up red with need and longing. She knew that he was driving both of them to a frenzy. Surely he would give in to their desire soon. Surely. She thought he was going to drive her mad with desire before that point, but then she looked down, catching his gaze with her own. Something passed between them then, some kind of understanding that had no words, no logic. Abruptly, Marcus was done teasing. He held her steady with one hand, and with the other he guided his manhood into her entrance. He let her weight carry her down, and in a few heartbeats he was lodged fully inside her, their bodies as close as they could get. "Oh," she whispered, and then his hands closed over her hips again. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all, driving up into her over and over again. She could feel the red heat inside her start to pulse in time with his thrusts, and after that she was lost to the primal rhythm of their lovemaking. Her body was tensing as if being wrenched tight, and every moment that passed she thought she would snap. When she didn't and the tension only rose higher, she started to sob, begging for the release that she knew only Marcus could give her. Jessica looked down at this beautiful man, the one that had saved her life again and again, and she knew in her heart that he was the only one who would ever open her like this, the only man who could give her this much pleasure, this much wild delight. He growled deep in his throat, thrusting up into her one more time, and then her body toppled over the edge. She felt as if she were coming apart into a shower of silver stars. Everything she was scattered by the pleasure that was rushing over her. She shook, Marcus's name on her lips, and when she felt him spill inside her, she knew that they belonged to one another. Her body felt as limp as a rag as she sprawled over his chest. It occurred to her vaguely that he might be suffocating, but his arms came up around her, holding her close. "I love you," she sighed softly, and without a moment of hesitation, he responded, "I love you. God, I love you so much." He rolled them to their sides, pulling away from her at last, but he did not let go of her. Instead, Jessica clung close to him, her face buried in his chest, matching him breath for breath. "Now will you tell me what's wrong?" she asked, and he sighed a rumbling sound. "Jessica?" She sat up, waiting for his response, but there was a knock at the door, brisk and commanding. Marcus looked up, dire murder in his eyes, but then the door swung open. Jessica yelped, grabbing for her discarded cloth, but Marcus rose up naked and furious to face the intruder. The woman who entered the room as if she owned it was not one of the people of the trees. Instead, she was tall and lean, her skin the brown of teak and her long dark hair swinging past her shoulders in a braid. There was a cat-like amusement and indifference in her eyes, and instinctively, Jessica knew that this was another shifter. "I gave you long enough," she said to Marcus. "The longer you stay, the greater the danger." "Marcus, what is she talking about?" Marcus turned to her, his eyes dark. There was something distant about him now that made her want to cry. A moment ago, they had been as close as two people could be, and now he felt as if he were sailing far away. "Jessica, this is Varen. She's of my people. She's from the sanctuary where I was taking the sword. The message from the fish was received, and when I didn't show up at the appointed time, she came looking for me." Varen turned those vivid green eyes to Jessica. To her surprise, she felt no enmity from the shifter woman, only a warmth, if a feline, feckless warmth. "And I see that he has a companion that he has kept at least slightly in the dark. Well, pet, there is good news and bad news. The good news is that the village where the sanctuary is located is close, a 5-hour march or so. The bad news is that the hunters are hot on your trail, and it is a war they are after." She paused delicately, and suddenly Jessica knew what a picture she made in Marcus's bed. Her hair tousled, a purplish love bite at her shoulder, and her lips kissed to bright red. "I don't suppose you will consent to be left behind?" "No," Jessica said, even as Marcus winced. It wasn't worth arguing. Where Marcus went, she went. "Then we need to move. We have a lead in front of the hunters, but there will be a war, and it is best fought on our terms, on our ground." Jessica turned to Marcus. There was a fire in his eyes she had never seen before. "Marcus? Remember what I said. I love you," he said. "Always. Remember that." Chapter 13. They marched through the night. The moon had risen, and the territory they were traveling through was clear enough that even Jessica could see her way without much accident. When she stumbled, Marcus steadied her with his hand, or she felt Varen's powerful panther body press against her, keeping her on her feet. Marcus walked as a man, Varen padded on all fours, and between them Jessica did her best to keep up. Kayla's healing had worked wonders, leaving her strong and rested, but there was an exhaustion at the edges of her mind, something that told her she would need to rest, truly rest, sooner rather than later. Dawn was just pearling the sky when a deep howl pierced the air. A lurch of fear shuddered through Jessica's body, leaving her looking around, but Varen looked utterly unconcerned. Marcus looked up with delight, and to Jessica's shock, he lifted his head and howled in kind, the sound identical to the one they had heard. "Friends are coming," he said, and suddenly the clearing was full of wolves. They streamed from the forest, standing higher than her hip at their shoulder. She could see several thin red wolves of the Indian subcontinent as well as the thickly built and powerful timber wolves of North America, and the slender golden wolves of Africa. They frisked like puppies around them, their eyes bright with human intelligence, and Jessica shook her head. "I am never going to be afraid of wild animals again," she mused, and Marcus glanced at her. "Well, there are some wild animals behind us that scare the hell out of me, so you can be brave for both of us." He joked, and then they were off again. When the sun was halfway past the horizon, they came to a village that greeted them with shouts of delight. It looked like many other villages that Jessica had visited in remote places in the world, but there was a heavy wooden wall that surrounded it. A tall woman, her skin as black as polished mahogany, and a serene beauty on her face, came out to greet them. "You are welcome to the sanctuary of shifters," she said in slightly accented English. "Be welcome, all." A loud shrieking went up from the trees, and Jessica's head jerked up. Now that she was looking for them, she could see the chimpanzees high in the trees. The people of the trees had been following them all night, and she had never noticed. The woman who had spoken looked up with surprise. "You have called some powerful allies to you, Marcus," she said, and he nodded grimly. "I am very much afraid that we will need them," he said. "We need to talk strategy." After that, everything seemed to speed up. Marcus touched her fingers with his, sending a spine-tingling jolt through her, and then he was gone. Jessica might have felt a little at a loss, but a tall young girl, her hair knotted tight to her head, and a fierce look of determination on her face, tugged her away. "You are human," she said bluntly. "You have no place in the fight to come." "I want to help, though," Jessica protested, and the girl nodded. "Come and help care for the children and the elderly. There is a safe place." Jessica knew with a pang that the girl was right. She would not be of any use in a fight between humans, let alone between one of shifters. She turned her head, scanning for perhaps one last glance at Marcus. But after a single glimpse of him, he was gone, swallowed by the crowd. "I want to help," she said firmly, and the girl smiled at her. The village and sanctuary were naturally fortified with the battlement wall of wood in front and a sheer rock face that stretched high behind. Both village and sanctuary had been in place for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years, and there were rough steps hewn into the stone. Jessica joined the long line of humans heading up the steep steps, carrying a little girl on her back. Though there were shifters, young ones or weak ones, scattered in that crowd, they were mostly humans. Jessica realized from their calm demeanor that this was something that had happened often enough that it did not panic them. They spoke a language that she didn't understand, and when they reached the cave, they all settled in to wait out the battle. Despite their calmness, however, Jessica could see that even the young children carried long knives. If any enemies made it up the stairs, they would be in for a grim surprise. Jessica's body ached with exhaustion, but she sat at the edge of the cave, her eyes scanning the jungle below for any sign of movement. The sanctuary protectors were as stealthy as those hunting them, and for almost an hour it was quiet, like there was nothing amiss. The tension was just in her head, and everything would pass peacefully. A sudden shout changed that, and from the heart of the forest stampeded a thick-tusked boar, as big as a pony, yet far more dangerous. It squealed a challenge before rushing straight for the wall, and Jessica had no doubt that if it struck, it would crash right through. Immediately after, however, a half-dozen gray wolves broke from cover, charging at the boar with tooth and fang. Though they were less than a quarter of the boar's size, they turned it, snapping at it viciously. Then the battle was joined in earnest, and the ground in front of the village was turned into a mass of snarling fur and fang. She could see animals leaping at each other, screaming, dying. But in all the tumult, she could not find Marcus. "Oh, please let him be all right. Please, please." She held her breath when a black panther leapt up out of the fray, coming down with claws out on what looked like a rampaging rhinoceros. It could have been Marcus, or perhaps it was Varen, or even some shifter she had not met yet. The rhino bucked hard, and the panther was flung off of it. It hit a nearby tree with an impact that Jessica could feel from where she watched. But it was spared the beast's trampling feet. In a moment, the panther was up and ripping at the rhino's face, and the beast bellowed with pain. The fighting swept over the scene, and Jessica was left without any view at all until she saw Marcus rise up in his human form at the edge of the fight. She could see the splotches of blood on his bare chest, saw how he moved like lightning. She reached out a hand as if she could protect him, and then he was launching himself across the clearing, a gleaming sword in his hand. It was an enormous tiger that sprang forward to meet him, an animal that would have dwarfed him even in his panther form. In his human form, wearing nothing but a dyed swath of fabric tied around his waist, Marcus looked ridiculously vulnerable, frail, and human. He had told her that the blade had powers, though, and now she could see them. He swung the blade hard and fast, and it bit into the tiger's shoulder. Marcus slid backwards at the impact, but then the tiger was leaping away, howling with pain. That was enough for a trio of nearby wolves to fall on it, and after that, the battle was over. The enemy was chased into the woods or killed, and the people around her raised a ragged cheer. It was another restless hour before they were told it was safe to come down. Jessica descended the stairs on shaky legs, and when she found level ground again, she thought that she might faint for a moment. Then she found the strength to go on and to find Marcus, but he found her first. He had hurriedly bathed the blood from his body, but otherwise he was as he had been in battle, bare-chested and powerful. He swept her up in his arms, and this time, Jessica couldn't help but burst into tears. "I was so scared. I thought you might die." "Not while you're here waiting for me," he said. "Not while you carry my heart in your chest. It would take more than that measly bunch to keep me from you." She laughed through her tears at his words, but there was some truth to it. She had given her heart to him too, and she knew that he would keep it safe. Chapter 14. There was a celebration that night, and Jessica had stayed close to Marcus's side as he introduced her to his friends and comrades, the people who, like him, protected the world that existed side by side with hers. She nodded and laughed and enjoyed the music and the dancing, but she was grateful to go to the hut that Marcus said was hers. When they made love that night, she felt as if she were falling into a sacred place made by their two bodies, a place that would never be lost. At the same time, she knew that this might be the last time they made love, and she strove to remember every touch, every kiss, and every caress. She had seen the way they looked at Marcus, how they regarded him and spoke about him. This was his place, his people. They needed him. She knew that she could have stayed with them and been happy forever. However, she was needed as well. Jessica rose early the next morning. She bathed in the cold water basin that was left for them, dressing as quickly as she could. When she looked around for her sample bag, she couldn't find it. She was on the verge of panicking until Marcus appeared, holding it in his hands. "Looking for this?" he asked as he handed it to her. "I am so sorry," she whispered. "I'd love nothing more than to stay here and be with you." Marcus pulled her into his arms and silenced her with a deep kiss. She clung to him, but she knew that it couldn't last. I know, he said at last. "I also know that you have a duty, just as I do, and I am so proud and humbled by the woman you are. You are here to save lives, and that's what you will do. I love you for it. I always will." "Marcus, I don't want to lose you," Jessica whispered, and he smiled at her. "You won't. You'll never lose me. We are bound to one another. You belong to me just as I belong to you. Right now, my place is here and yours isn't. I swear to you, though, I will come to you as soon as I can." "I believe you," Jessica said, smiling through her tears. An hour later, she was walking away from the sanctuary, a slim young man walking beside her as her guide. The village she needed to reach was only a day's march away, and by tomorrow, she would be doing the work the WHO had sent her to Tanzania to do. Marcus stood at the gates of the sanctuary, and she knew in her heart he would look after her fading form long after she was gone. I love him. My heart belongs to a shifter, she thought, and nothing about this world will ever be the same. This has been CLAWED, Were Soldier Warriors, Book 1. Written by Kim Dillon. Narrated by Nikki Kwiatkowski. Copyright 2017 by Lovestruck Romance. Production copyright 2018 by Kim Dillon.